Welcome everybody, you're watching The Last Walk. Today I'll be pulling the worst cases of the most reckless and most brutal deaths the woods have ever seen. From a woman who was about to become the best example I have of why you can never ignore the warnings in a national forest, to a lifelong hunter disappeared into the Bighorn Mountains, leaving behind only a few clues and years of unanswered questions.
It was October 18th, 2019. Up in the higher parts of western North Carolina, it had been raining a lot leading up to that. Not like a storm or anything dramatic every second, but just enough that the trail stayed wet. The forest floor was basically covered in this thick layer of damp leaves, and yeah, it made everything kind of slippery. On top of that, nights were already getting colder. You could feel mid-autumn really settling in. Now, Francine Bush, she was 22 at the time, was living in Asheville. She worked part-time as a barista and had been doing that for about a year. Pretty normal setup, really. Nothing unusual there. I want to be clear about what kind of account this was because it matters. She wasn't doing fake ghost stuff. She was doing actual research and walking people through it. But in her free time, she had this small TikTok account where she'd post videos about local legends, old abandoned places, and bits of history around western North Carolina. Nothing over the top, nothing fake, spooky, or anything like that. It was usually just her walking through a spot and talking about it in a pretty straightforward way, explaining what used to be there or what people said about it, that kind of thing. By that point, she had maybe around 4,800 followers. Not huge, but enough that people were clearly interested in what she was doing. Her friend Zachary Sanders was the one who often went with her. She was 21, studying communications at UNC Asheville. They'd known each other since their first year of college, so they were pretty close. Lately, Zachary had started helping out more with the videos filming, carrying some of the gear, sometimes even appearing on camera herself. She wasn't really any kind of experienced hiker or outdoors person either, just a bit more active than Francine. But mostly, she was just there because she enjoyed it and trusted Francine's judgment on where they were going. And that's kind of where things start getting interesting, because the idea for this particular trip didn't come from them originally, it actually came from TikTok. In the weeks leading up to Halloween that year, several small TikTok accounts began posting videos claiming that they'd found an abandoned section of old logging infrastructure somewhere in Pisgah National Forest near Brevard. Most of the clips showed an overgrown railway grade, a partially collapsed stone drainage passage beneath the old embankment, and echoes that creators claimed sounded unnatural. The exact location was never identified. The framing on those videos was doing a lot of work. Dark footage and ambient sound can make an ordinary drainage culvert feel like this portal to somewhere else. The location wasn't shown on official Forest Service maps, and there weren't any signs pointing to it. Instead, they found a few old blog posts from around 2015 that talked about remnants of early 20th century logging railroads, mentioning an abandoned railway grade and a partially collapsed stone culvert beneath it. They didn't give exact coordinates or anything like that, just rough directions, like pointing you toward landmarks in the forest and basically saying it should be around here somewhere. And that was the kind of thing Francine and Zachary had come across right before deciding to look into it. Francine believed she could approach the location differently. Rather than filming another ghost-themed video, she planned to record a factual walkthrough about the old logging railroad remnants in the area and explain how the drainage passage could easily create the echoes people were reporting. That's honestly a more interesting video concept than what the other accounts were doing. She was trying to correct the record. She chose the Friday before Halloween because both she and Zachary were free the following day. Neither of them told anyone exactly where they were going or that they expected to leave the marked trail. Francine relied on a printed screenshot of the 2015 directions, which referenced landmarks such as a split oak tree and an old railway berm instead of coordinates. She did not download an offline map. She carried her phone for filming and navigation, along with a handheld ring light. Although she had packed a portable battery, she accidentally left it in the cup holder of her car before starting the hike. I've done that, grabbed the charger, set it on the seat, gotten out of the car without it. The difference is, I've never needed it the way that she needed it that night. Zachary brought her phone, 2 disposable hand warmers, and a small crossbody bag containing a few personal items. Both women wore leggings, light athletic jackets, and sneakers. Neither wore insulated clothing or hiking boots. Francine's 2011 Honda Civic stopped at a gas station in Brevard, North Carolina for fuel and snacks before they continued toward Pisgah National Forest. The cashier on duty was later interviewed by investigators. He recalled the 2 women arriving together in good spirits and filming near the fuel pumps before coming inside. He remembered one of them asking about an old railroad passage somewhere in the national forest. The interaction stood out because they appeared lightly dressed for the cool conditions and didn't seem to be carrying hiking equipment. He had heard of a tunnel in the area but had never visited it himself. He didn't have any reason to stop them, but that image, two women in athletic jackets asking about a tunnel heading into Pisgah at that hour, clearly lodged itself in his memory. Looking back, he told investigators it seemed like an unusually late time to be starting a hike, though he had no reason to think anything was wrong. They continued along a Forest Service road into Pisgah National Forest through a corridor of second-growth hardwood before narrowing near several trailheads. The road had no streetlights, and beyond the standard Forest Service signs, there was little to distinguish one section from another at night. By the time they reached the trailhead, the only other vehicle belonged to a retired couple camping at a nearby primitive site. One of the campers later told investigators they heard a car arrive and noticed two women preparing to head into the forest. The witness remembered thinking it was unusually late for anyone to begin a hike, but saw nothing that suggested an emergency. There is no record of what was said between Franchane and Zafari after leaving the parking area. The first draft video recovered from Franchane's phone shows them walking along the main gravel trail with the ring light held at shoulder height, illuminating only a short distance ahead. They are laughing, and investigators were able to confirm that only the two women can be heard in the recording. There's a second video after that. They're a little farther along the trail now. Zafari is filming, and at one point she slowly moves the phone light out toward the trees, just scanning the area as they walk. Nothing dramatic, more like she's checking what's around them as they continue forward. That slow pan she does into the trees, it's such a normal thing to do at night in the woods, and you can tell neither of them are even rattled at this point. In a third recording, Franchane turns her phone toward what they're seeing and compares the landscape with the printed directions they brought. She's pointing things out as she goes, basically trying to match the landmarks step by step. From the way she speaks and moves, she seems fairly confident that they're still on the correct route. Later, investigators noted that there was no clear indication from the main trail that any maintained or public path continued in that direction. No visible side trail breaking off, no worn-down footpath in the leaf litter, and no signage or markers suggesting access to the old railway grade. Once they left the gravel trail, they were essentially in unmanaged forest, where navigation depended entirely on recognizing natural features and interpreting vague written directions. After comparing the terrain with the printed instructions, Franchane identifies what she believes is the split white oak mentioned in the blog post. That becomes the reference point for her decision. She steps off the marked trail first, and Zafari follows behind her without hesitation. From there, they begin moving uphill through dense, uncut forest. The conditions change almost immediately. The gravel trail gives way to a steeper, uneven slope softened by recent rainfall. Wet leaves cover exposed roots and scattered rocks, making footing less stable and harder to read with each step. The lighting from their phones doesn't really help much either. It creates sharp shadows that shift with movement, which makes it harder to judge depth and see changes in elevation ahead. Within a short distance, they entered a dense rhododendron. Rhododendron in the southern Appalachians is its own category of obstacle. The locals call it rhododendron hells, and that's not hyperbole. At that elevation, the shrubs formed a nearly continuous understory, with interlocking branches that severely limited visibility and made movement slow. In darkness, gaps between the branches could easily resemble a path, even when they were nothing more than the easiest route through the vegetation. Visibility was often limited to only a few feet beyond the light source. Based on the timestamps from the recovered videos, investigators estimated they spent roughly 10 to 15 minutes climbing off trail before reaching the old railway berm. After several minutes of climbing, the slope appeared to level off. They had reached an old railway berm, an elevated earthwork built for narrow-gauge logging trains during the early 20th century. Approaching from below at night, the overgrown berm resembled a flat section of ground rather than the edge of an embankment. Years of leaf accumulation and vegetation growth had softened the edges of the embankment, making it difficult to distinguish from the surrounding forest floor when approached from below at night. Beyond it was a drop of roughly 14 feet into a narrow, root-filled gully. Zafari reached the berm first, with Franchane only a few feet behind. As she stepped onto a moss-covered rock near the edge, her footing gave way. She lost her balance before she could recover and fell over the far side of the berm, dropping about 12 feet into the gully below. She landed awkwardly with her right foot striking an exposed root, absorbing most of the impact. 12 feet doesn't sound like much until you land wrong on an exposed root in the dark. The injury was immediate and severe. Franchane, still behind the berm's crest, heard the fall and descended the embankment carefully to reach her friend. Zafari's right ankle was already beginning to swell, and she was unable to bear any weight on it. They were now together in a root-tangled gully beyond the old railway berm, with the marked trail somewhere below and behind them after roughly 10 to 15 minutes of climbing through dense rhododendron. There was no clear way back. Franchane checked her phone at that point. It only had a single bar of signal kind of flickering in and out, not stable at all. She tried calling emergency services right away, but the call just wouldn't go through. It failed before it could even properly connect. She tried again, and then once more. Same result every time. The calls just dropped before anything could happen. Later on, when investigators went through the phone, they confirmed there were multiple emergency call attempts in that exact window, all unsuccessful. Her battery was also starting to matter now. It was sitting at about 31%, and the ring light they'd been using earlier was still connected to her phone through Bluetooth, draining power since they left the trail. So she turns it off to save battery. At that point, she kind of pauses and looks at everything, the phone, the weak signal, the battery level, and makes a decision based on what she's got in front of her.
I don't think that decision was reckless. Given what she knew and what she had, going for higher grounds to find signal is a logical call. The problem was everything she didn't know.
Her plan is basically this. She's going to climb back over the berm, then keep going uphill along the ridge, trying to reach higher ground. The idea is that if she gets higher up, she might finally catch a stronger signal and be able to make that emergency call. She estimates it would take maybe 10 to 15 minutes to get there. Before she goes, she leaves Zafari with what she has on her, both hand warmers from the crossbody bag and the ring light, which runs on its own battery. Zafari keeps her phone ready with the flashlight open, just in case. The idea is simple. If she hears Franchane coming back, she'll call out and she can use the light if she needs to signal her. Franchane climbed back over the berm and began moving. This was the last moment the two women saw each other. As Franchane moved away from the berm and farther along the ridge, maintaining her sense of direction became increasingly difficult. In daylight, the terrain was straightforward to navigate with a map. At night, surrounded by dense rhododendrons and relying on her phone as both her only light source and navigation aid, the landscape became far more difficult to read. Openings in the brush often resembled footpaths, but were usually game trails, following the contours of the hillside rather than leading uphill or downhill. Franchane followed one of these openings. Based on the recovered video timestamps, physical evidence documented during the search, and the surrounding terrain, investigators estimated she spent roughly 20 to 30 minutes following what appeared to be a game trail before realizing she was no longer making progress. When the path widened briefly, she recognized a fallen log she believed she had passed earlier while still on the marked trail. She realized she had circled back without intending to.
That moment, recognizing a landmark you've already passed, is one of the more disorienting things that can happen to you in the woods at night.
She returned to the last opening she remembered and tried a different route. It also followed the hillside. In the narrow beam from her phone, every direction looked much the same. Tree trunks, dense rhododendron, and uneven ground. She stopped several times to listen, but the wind moving through the upper canopy made it difficult to judge where any sound was coming from.
Weather observations from the higher elevations surrounding the search area indicated temperatures had fallen to about 36 degrees Fahrenheit and continued to drop overnight.
Zafari, in the gully, had been sitting on saturated ground for nearly an hour and a half. She was stationary, the ankle injury made standing impossible, and any attempt to reposition on the uneven root-filled ground was too painful to sustain. The hand warmers she held were still producing heat, but only in her hands. They did little to offset the cold coming through her leggings from the wet ground beneath her. Wet ground conducts heat away from the body much faster than cold air alone. Unable to move, she could no longer generate enough body heat to offset that loss.
That detail about the wet ground stays with me. It's not the air temperature doing the most damage, it's what she's sitting on.
She called out at intervals, but the wind moving through the ridge carried much of the sound away. Franchane was still moving. During the search, teams later identified multiple areas of disturbed vegetation, along with intermittent footwear impressions. These were consistent with someone repeatedly moving through the ridgeline after becoming disoriented. When investigators put everything together, the terrain, the recovered phone data, and the documented search findings, they concluded she had likely been following a network of interconnected game trails. Instead of leading her back to the marked path, these trails kept looping through the same general area. At several points, she had likely been much closer to the main trail than she realized.
I keep coming back to that. She was close, the trail was close, and the terrain just wouldn't let her find it.
But the game trails followed the natural contours of the hillside, repeatedly guiding movement back into familiar sections rather than toward a clear exit or the original route. Sometime during the early morning hours, Franchane's phone battery was exhausted, leaving her without either a light source or any means of attempting another emergency call. She eventually sat down beneath a large red oak and pulled her jacket close. She had been moving for nearly 3 hours. Her core temperature was still adequate. The exertion had kept her from the threshold of real danger, but her phone battery was dead, her light was gone, and the wind had picked up again. She could no longer identify a direction or any recognizable landmark. Investigators later concluded that she remained beneath the tree for the rest of the night. Physical evidence documented during the search, including the location of her phone and the absence of any continued trackway beyond the tree, indicated that she did not resume traveling. At some point during the night, the ring light finally died, and Zafari was just left in complete darkness. The hand warmers stopped doing much not long after that.
The early morning hours, temperatures at the higher elevations surrounding the search area were estimated to be around 29 degrees Fahrenheit.
So she's basically sitting there for hours on soaked ground, not really able to move around or do anything to warm herself up.
29 degrees, wet ground, no insulation, no ability to move. I don't have a way to make that sound less serious than it was.
And that wet ground just keeps pulling heat out of her body the whole time. Slow, constant, nothing she can really stop. Investigators later noted that, with the severity of her ankle injury and the steep slope around that gully, she probably wouldn't have been able to climb back up toward the berm without help, even if she wanted to. She did call out every so often during the night, just short bursts, trying to see if anyone was close enough to hear, but the area was thick, with vegetation, uneven ground, all of that, so her voice wouldn't have carried very far. And as the hours went on and hypothermia started to set in, investigators believed those calls would have become less frequent, just as she got more exhausted and less able to keep going. By mid-morning, the retired couple camping near the trailhead noticed that the same vehicle remained parked where it had been the previous evening. After waiting for some time and seeing no one return from the forest, one of the campers contacted emergency services. Deputies responding to the trailhead identified the vehicle's registered owner and spoke with the campers, who confirmed they had seen two women enter the forest the previous evening, but had not seen them return. Investigators also noted that no other vehicles had arrived or departed from the trailhead overnight, making it unlikely that the pair had left by another route. Based on the available information, responders concluded that both women were still somewhere within the surrounding forest, and the incident was immediately escalated into a search and rescue operation. Search managers initially divided the surrounding forest into sectors using witness statements, the location of the parked vehicle, recovered video timestamps, and the terrain most likely to have been followed after the pair left the marked trail. Ground teams searched both sides of the ridgeline, while canine units worked likely travel corridors, drainages, and areas of dense vegetation. As new evidence was located, search priorities were adjusted, and the search area was expanded. Because investigators believed the two women had likely become separated during the night, teams treated them as independent search subjects while continuing to coordinate information between search crews. Several hours into the search, one of the ground teams eventually found Franchane farther along the ridge, underneath a large red oak tree. Her phone was right there nearby, completely dead. Investigators later noted there wasn't any sign she had kept moving after she reached that spot. She was unresponsive when rescuers reached her. Paramedics immediately began advanced resuscitation measures at the scene before transporting her to the hospital, where she was later pronounced dead.
I don't know how to just move past that image. She made it through the night. She was 4/10 of a mile from the trailhead.
Not long after that, another search team located Zafari about 4/10 of a mile from the trailhead. She was unresponsive when rescuers reached her. She was found partially curled up on the ground, with her hands drawn in toward her chest, something investigators later pointed out is often seen in advanced hypothermia cases. The hand warmers beside her were already cold, and the ring light had long since shut off. Paramedics also began resuscitation at the scene before transporting her to the hospital, where she was later pronounced dead. The county medical examiner determined that Zafari Sanders died from hypothermia, resulting from prolonged environmental exposure and an inability to move after sustaining a severe ankle injury. Hospital records documented profound hypothermia on arrival, with a core body temperature in the low 80s Fahrenheit. Imaging confirmed a displaced lateral malleolus fracture of the right ankle, an injury consistent with her inability to bear weight. The medical examiner concluded that the combination of prolonged immobility, inadequate clothing, saturated ground, and overnight temperatures that fell to about 29 degrees Fahrenheit led to fatal heat loss. There were no significant injuries beyond the ankle fracture, and toxicology results were negative. The medical examiner separately determined that Franchane Bouche died of hypothermia, resulting from prolonged environmental exposure after becoming lost on the ridgeline. Examination found no traumatic injuries sufficient to cause death. The investigation concluded that
that after becoming disoriented and losing the marked trail, she remained exposed to overnight temperatures without adequate insulation until succumbing to hypothermia. Investigators reconstructed the sequence of events using physical evidence, witness statements, recovered phone data, search and rescue documentation, and the locations where both women were found. The unpublished TikTok draft videos recovered from her phone provided timestamps for the walk and helped investigators determine where the two women left the marked trail. The cashier's statement documented their clothing, limited equipment, and state of preparation before entering the forest. Statements from the campers at the trailhead confirmed that both women entered the forest later that evening, while the emergency call from the campsite established the beginning of the rescue response. Physical evidence at the berm, including slide marks on the moss-covered rock and a fragment of sneaker outsole recovered near the base of the gully, identified the location of the fall. Search teams also documented disturbed vegetation and intermittent footwear impressions consistent with the reconstructed route investigators believed Franchane had taken after leaving the berm. By comparing the locations of disturbed vegetation, intermittent footwear impressions, recovered phone data, and the surrounding topography, investigators determined that she had unknowingly followed several interconnected game trails. Rather than climbing consistently toward higher ground or descending toward the trails curved along the contours of the hillside and repeatedly returned her to the same section of ridgeline. Investigators noted that the incident illustrated a well-documented hazard of dense rhododendron terrain where game trails can easily be mistaken for usable routes after leaving an established trail. They also noted that once hikers leave established trails in heavily vegetated terrain, even relatively short distances can become difficult to retrace in darkness. Small navigation errors, particularly when combined with injury, limited equipment, and falling temperatures, can rapidly develop into life-threatening emergencies despite remaining relatively close to maintained trails. It was the afternoon of the 13th of July, 2019, in the Tonto National Forest, out in the raw desert country, miles from the nearest trailhead, the heat coming off the bare rock in waves, when a 25-year-old woman stood alone on the wrong side of a wash that an hour before had been bone dry and was now a wall of moving brown water, her pack and nearly all of her water gone with it. A storm sliding off to the east, the clouds already breaking apart and the desert heat pressing back in, and nobody who could rescue her knew that she was stranded out there at all. Kayla Jen Nibbler was 25 years old, and she was not the kind of person you would expect this to happen to. She was fit, she was stubborn in the good way as well as the bad, and she had spent the last couple of years working through a personal list of the hardest desert routes in Arizona, one brutal trip at a time. She filmed most of them for a small but real following, a few thousand people who liked that she was not a professional or a sponsored athlete, just a regular young woman with a 9-to-5 who kept doing hard things on her days off. She was very good at it. She trained for these trips, she knew how to read a trail, she had turned back before on days that felt wrong, and the people who knew her would tell you she was one of the most determined people they had ever met. That determination is the whole story. It had carried her up 100 hard climbs, and it was the exact thing that would not let her stop on the one day that stopping was the only thing that could have saved her. And none of it was really about fame. People who knew her said the challenge began as something personal, a way to prove to herself she could still do hard things after a rough couple of years. And the following came later, almost by accident. It is easy to watch someone film themselves in a dangerous place and write them off as reckless or vain. Kayla was neither. She was a serious person chasing a serious goal, which is exactly why the warning slid off her the way they did. This is the part that matters. Kayla was not careless in the way people picture. She did a lot of things right. She kept herself in real shape, she carried a small first aid kit and a headlamp, she usually studied the route the night before, and she almost always let someone know she was going out. The problem was never that she did not know the rules. The problem was that she had gotten so good and gotten away with so much that she had quietly started to believe the rules bent around her. And the few gaps she did leave, not quite enough water for the kind of heat that was coming, no way to call for help without a cell signal, and no one who knew her exact route, were the specific gaps that this one day would find. Let me be fair to her, because she was no clueless tourist who wandered off a parking lot. She was skilled, she was experienced, and that's the part that unsettles me the most about it. Arizona is a place that warns you constantly. The trailheads out here are covered in signs. The heat, the water you need to carry, the flash floods, the closures, and most people going right past them have learned to treat all of it as background noise. The warnings are always there, and the vast majority of the time, nothing happens. And that is exactly what makes them so easy to ignore. Kayla had gone past 100 of those signs and come home fine every single time. That is the trap.
100 trips that all end well do not teach you that the warnings are wrong, but they slowly teach you that they are not really meant for you. Every warning she blew past and survived did not feel like luck to her. It felt like proof. Proof that she was tougher than the sign, smarter than the forecast, more capable than the people who turned around. Each time nothing went wrong, the voice telling her to be careful got a little bit quieter. It is the same process that gets seasoned drivers killed on roads they have driven 1,000 times. Familiarity starts to feel like safety, and the two are not the same thing. The route she picked that summer was not one of the popular, crowded trails. It was a little-used official trail out in the backcountry of the Tonto National Forest, a long, hard push to a remote overlook that almost nobody bothers with in the heart of summer, and that was the entire appeal. Anybody could do the easy, popular routes in spring, when the weather is kind and the parking lot is full. Doing something remote and brutal, alone, in the worst heat of the year, and filming every step of it was the kind of thing that set her apart from every other account posting the same crowded spots. She had a screenshot of the route on her phone, a rough plan in her head, and a promise to her followers that she was finally going to knock this one off her list. There were clips of her the night before, laying her gear out on the floor, talking fast and happy, telling everyone this was going to be the hardest one yet and that the view was going to be worth all of it. In one of those night before clips, Kayla reads a comment out loud from a follower, asking if it is really safe to go out on a route like that alone in July. She laughs and says people are way too scared of these trips if you are actually prepared for them, that being ready is the whole point, and that she would always rather be the one who went. She tells them to keep watching, because tomorrow was going to be a big one. The morning she left, Kayla texted her closest friend from the car, the way she always did before a big trip. She wrote that she was parked and ready, that it was already hot but she had a good head start on the day, and that this was the one she had been waiting for. Her friend texted back to be careful in that heat, and Kayla answered that she would be fine, that she had done worse, and that she would send photos from the top the second she got a bar of service. Here is the thing people from outside Arizona do not understand about a national forest like the Tonto. Most of it is not shady pine woods. It is close to 3 million acres of raw Sonoran desert and rugged backcountry, bare rock and thorn and dry washes, where, in summer, the temperature out on the open ground regularly climbs past 110. There is very little shade and almost no reliable water anywhere. Out there, water is not a comfort item. It is the only thing keeping you alive, and it goes faster than most people expect. In heat like that, an active person can burn through more than a liter every hour, and even 6 liters can vanish faster than anyone expects, and there is nowhere to refill and nothing to hide under. Help is a long way off too. The nearest paved road can be hours away on foot, and a rescue team, once anyone even knows to send one, has to cross that same ground in that same heat before reaching you. Distance out here is not measured in miles, it is measured in how much water you have left. And the cruel thing is how normal it all feels, right up until it does not. The morning is pleasant, the trail is quiet, you feel strong. There is no single dramatic moment where the desert announces that it has decided to kill you. It just keeps taking a little more out of you than you put back, hour after hour, until you are already in serious trouble and never noticed the line you crossed. And in July, there is a second danger stacked right on top of the first. It is monsoon season, when huge storms boil up in the afternoons and dump an unbelievable amount of rain in minutes. That rain does not soak into the hard desert ground, it runs straight off, and it all funnels into the dry washes and canyons and turns them in the space of a few minutes into deadly flash floods. The part that kills people is that the storm does not have to be anywhere near them. Rain falling miles away, up on higher ground, can send a wall of water down a wash that is bone dry and sunny where you are standing. People are swept away in Arizona almost every year, doing nothing more than standing in the wrong dry stream bed at the wrong moment. Locals grow up with one rule for it: never camp in a wash and never cross one that is running, and every summer someone from out of town learns why the hard way. The water comes with almost no sound at first, and then all at once, and by the time you can hear it coming, it is usually already too late to climb out. None of those warning signs are there by accident. Every one of them exists because someone ignored the same danger before and did not come back. I could never make people believe this until they see it for themselves, but a national forest can cook you and drown you on the very same afternoon. The warning started before she even took a single step. The trailhead that morning had everything posted that you could possibly ask for. There was the standard sign about carrying enough water and the danger of pushing out into extreme heat. There was a fresh notice that the National Weather Service had an excessive heat warning in effect for the whole region that day, along with a flash flood watch for the afternoon. There was a permanent sign: the kind they only bother to put up where people have actually died, telling everyone to stay out of the washes during storms. And there was a Forest Service advisory because a storm a couple of weeks earlier had washed out sections of the upper part of the route. It strongly recommended that people stay off that stretch until crews could repair it. The trail technically remained open, so anyone who continued did so at their own risk, and pushing straight through that kind of warning was exactly what Kayla had trained herself to do. On top of every one of those signs, there was a person. A volunteer trail steward was at the trailhead that morning, one of those weekend regulars who check in with people heading out and try to talk the unprepared ones into waiting for a better day. He spoke to Kayla directly. He told her plainly that it was already dangerously hot, that a strong storm was in the afternoon forecast, and that the upper part of the route was washed out and the Forest Service was advising people to avoid that section. He mentioned that crews had been called out to help people in trouble on that same ground in previous summers. He remembers that she was polite and friendly, that she thanked him for looking out for her, and that she shouldered her pack and went on past him anyway. A person looked her in the eye and told her not to go. I keep coming back to that because in her situation, it's so easy to smile, thank them, and step past them thinking you knew better. There is a clip from that morning of Kayla panning her camera slowly across the wall of warning signs at the trailhead, laughing about how the desert really does not want anyone to have any fun out here. She jokes that if she stopped for every sign in this state, she would never get anywhere, and then she turns the camera on her own face, grins, and says she did not drive 3 hours before sunrise just to read a sign and go home. A little way up the route, she posted one last short clip while she still had a bar of signal, a slow sweep across the empty country ahead of her with not another soul in sight. She tells her followers that this is the whole reward, that everyone else is crowded onto the easy trails while she has all of this to herself, and that the people who listen to every warning never get to see anything like it. It was the last thing she would manage to post before the signal gave out for good. A few miles in, with the sun really starting to bite, Kayla passed the last people who would ever see her out there. It was a small group on their way back down, soaked through with sweat and plainly done for the day. They stopped her and told her the truth, that it was hotter than anything worth it up top, that big clouds were already stacking up to the south, and that they had cut their own trip short and were getting themselves out while they still could. They told her, in plain words, that she should turn around too. This was not a couple of nervous beginners either. By their own account, they were experienced desert hands who did this kind of thing all the time, and even they had looked at the sky and the heat and called it a day. That is the part that should have landed hardest. That the people telling her to quit were exactly the kind of person she thought of herself as. They would later become a huge part of how any of this is even known, because they remembered her clearly, a cheerful, confident young woman filming as she climbed, who thanked them for the heads up, told them she was close, and had come too far to quit, and kept going up as they made their way down. When they heard, days later, that a woman had gone missing on that route, they came forward on their own, and the time and place where they had crossed paths with her gave the search one of its only fixed points. They said afterward that they had gone back and forth about whether to be more forceful, whether they should have flatly refused to let her pass, and that they have had to make peace with the fact that you cannot save someone who has already decided they are the exception. In a clip she filmed not long after passing them, Kayla is breathing hard, sweat running down her face, saying that a group just tried to talk her into turning back, but that quitting has never really been her style. She holds the camera out at the country shimmering in the heat all around her and tells her followers that this right here is the exact thing that separates the people who actually finish from the people who always find an excuse. I still can't wrap my head around how many separate times she was told to stop. Not a vague little sign that she could pretend not to see, told out loud by real people standing right in front of her. The warnings did not even stop once she was alone. Kayla still had a thin thread of cell signal for part of the climb, and her friend, watching the forecast back home in town and growing more and more worried, texted her about it. The friend told her a severe storm was popping up on the radar right over that part of the forest and begged her to head back down before it hit. It was the last real back and forth the two of them would ever have. Her friend's texts were blunt and scared, that there was a serious storm building right over that part of the forest, and that she needed to get down, now, not soon, now. Kayla wrote back that she could see a few clouds, but that she was basically at the top already, that she would tag the overlook, grab her shots, and be moving back down inside 20 minutes, and that she would text the moment she was back at the car. She told her friend, gently, that she worried too much. That was the last message her friend would get from her for a very long time. Even alone, she was still being warned, and that's the part that scares me. Her friend sat a town away, watching the storm crawl across the screen, begging her to run, and she still thought she was fine. She did reach the overlook, and by everything she filmed up there, it was exactly what she had come for. There is footage recovered from her phone long afterward, of her at the high point, with the whole desert rolled out behind her, turning in a slow circle, breathing hard and grinning, calling it the hardest one on the list so far and worth every step. And then, instead of doing the thing she had just promised her friend she would do, she stayed. She filmed more. She sat down and took it in. She was already low on water by then, down to the last of what she had carried up, and behind her, in shot after shot, you can watch the clouds she had been warned about all morning, stacking into something enormous and dark and close. Anyone who knows that country, watching that footage now, feels their stomach drop, because her window to get down safely was closing fast while she framed one more shot. She spent what little time she had left on content. In her last clip from the top, Kayla is still smiling, telling her followers that this is the best one on the whole challenge so far, and that she cannot believe she almost let a few strangers talk her out of it. Off to one side of the frame, the sky is already the wrong color, a deep bruised gray moving in fast. She does not mention it even once. She is looking at the view, not the weather.
I need you to realize this before we go on. She already made it, and she accomplished everything she came all this way for. But reaching that top was never going to be the hardest part.
By the time Kayla finally packed up and started down, she was late, she was low on water, and the storm was right on top of her. The wind came up first, then the lightning, and then the rain, hard and sudden the way it only falls out here in the summer. She was caught out on exposed rock in about the worst possible place to be in a lightning storm, and that is when she made the decision that ties this entire story together. Instead of staying on the long, open, marked way she had come up, she dropped down off the side of it into a drainage. A dry wash that cut straight down the slope and looked like a faster, lower way out of the lightning and the heat. It was the one thing every single sign at that trailhead had warned her not to do. It was the washed out ground the advisory had flagged. It was the flash flood ground. It was the exact danger she had filmed herself laughing about that very morning. In fairness to her, in that moment, it probably felt like the smart call. She was exposed to lightning on open rock, she was overheating, and the drainage looked like the fastest line down and out of it. Every instinct screaming at her to get low and get down was right about the lightning and catastrophically wrong about the water. It is the kind of call that looks foolish written down and felt completely reasonable in the moment. Cold rain stinging her skin, thunder overhead, the marked route a long exposed slog, and the wash a quick shaded line down. She took the danger she could see over the one she could not.
This is the choice I keep thinking about, and it's not the late start or the water. The moment she stepped down into that wash, every warning from that morning became the ground under her feet.
She could not have known how much rain had already fallen higher up the drainage, because the storm that fed the flood was not even directly over her, and that is precisely what makes these floods so deadly. The wash she climbed down into was dry when she stepped into it. A few minutes later, it was not. Investigators believe she was already well down inside it when the water arrived, a surge of brown water and mud and debris that filled the narrow channel in seconds. She got out. The disturbed soil along the bank suggested she had climbed out of the wash as it flooded, which took more strength and luck than most people would ever have had in them. But the flood took her pack with it as it went, and with her pack went nearly all of her remaining water. The examination later found injuries consistent with a hard fall on that rock, which fits exactly what it takes to fight your way out of a flooding channel. And now she was in the worst spot yet, stranded on the far side of a wash that had suddenly become a river, cut off from her only way back, hurt, almost completely out of water as the storm slid off to the east and the oppressive desert heat slowly returned. The first message Kayla tried to send after the flood, one of several that would never go through, told her friend that something had gone badly wrong. She wrote that she was okay but shaken, that she had lost her pack in a flash flood, that she had almost no water left, and that she was stuck on the wrong side of a wash she could not get back across. She said she was going to wait for the water to drop and then find a way around it. She still, even then, sounded like someone who fully believed she was going to make it out of this. At some point, she tried to send one more update, and it stuck and failed like all the rest. In it, she told her friend that she was not doing well, that it was so hot she could not think straight, and that if she did not text again soon, her friend should please call for help and tell them roughly where she had gone. It was a clear-headed, responsible message, and it never reached a single living soul. What happened after that is not really a mystery, because the desert does the same thing to people caught out in it with no water almost every time. In heat like that, with nothing left to drink, the body simply cannot keep up any longer, and sweating alone is no longer enough to keep it cool. Most people first develop heat exhaustion, the weakness and the pounding head and the dizziness and the cramping. Then, as it tips over into full heat stroke, the real damage moves to the brain. Confusion sets in early, thinking gets slow and muddled, judgment falls apart, coordination goes, and people in that state very often make strange, poor decisions with no idea at all that they are doing it. From the way she was later found, it looks like Kayla did the sensible thing and tried to wait it out, wedged into what little shade a low ledge of rock could offer. It simply was not enough. The wash that had nearly drowned her 1 hour had also cut off her only path home. She spent her last hours soaked from the flood, then baking in the heat, hurt and out of water, waiting on a rescue that no one had been told to send. That's just so brutal, it leaves me speechless. She was found 5 days after anyone had last heard from her, well off the marked route, down near the wash that had trapped her, tucked into the poor shade of the same ledge where she had tried to wait it out. No one had worried at first, because she often went quiet for a day while she drove home and edited, so it was only when she missed work that her friend, the same one who had begged her to turn around, raised the alarm, and by then it was already far too late. The search, once it started, was led by the Gila County Sheriff's Office with the Tonto National Forest assisting, and the thing that finally broke it open was her car, found sitting right there at the trailhead, which let searchers pull landmarks out of her posted videos and narrow miles of empty backcountry down to the drainage below the overlook. Her phone was recovered with her, and even though the battery had been dead for days, examiners were able to pull her footage and several unsent draft messages off of it. The medical examiner determined the cause of death was environmental hyperthermia caused by heat exposure, with dehydration a major factor, most likely on that first afternoon, and documented injuries consistent with a fall. And that really is how all of this is known. None of it is guesswork. It comes from her own recovered footage and draft messages, from the Gila County investigation and the medical examiner, from the weather warnings still sitting on public record, and from the living people who tried to stop her, the volunteer at the trailhead, the group who passed her and later came forward, and the friend on the other end of those texts, the one who raised the alarm and has been telling Kayla's story ever since. In the time since, her family and that friend have tried to turn the worst thing that ever happened to them into something that might spare somebody else's daughter, and they keep coming back to the boring rules that never once make for a good video, respecting a heat warning and a flash flood watch instead of filming a joke about them, honoring an advisory sign because it is almost always there for a very real reason, carrying far more water than you think you could ever need, and turning back the moment it runs low, never dropping into a wash when there is a storm anywhere in the sky, and telling one trusted person your exact route and the time you plan to be back. One of the final draft messages recovered from her phone, never delivered, was only a few words, just that she was so hot, that she was so sorry, and that she just wanted to come home. None of it will bring her back, but it might, on some other blazing afternoon, be the one thing that turns the next stubborn, capable, determined person back toward the trailhead while there is still time. None of this had to happen, and that's the most frustrating part about this whole thing. She was among the most capable people out there, warned again and again, and she still decided the warnings couldn't apply to her. Buffalo, Wyoming sits right at the eastern edge of the Bighorn Mountains, and it's the kind of place where people have always had a close connection with the land around them. It's a small town, just a little over 4,000 people, and a lot of everyday life there has been shaped by ranching, oil field work, and of course, hunting season. And every year around late September, you start to see the same thing happen. Pickup trucks loaded with coolers, tents, camping gear, and rifle cases begin making their way west out of town toward the mountains. For a lot of locals, heading into the Bighorns isn't some rare adventure. It's just something people have been doing for generations. I love that image, honestly. It's not some big production or a once-in-a-lifetime event for these people. It's just a normal part of their everyday lives. The Bighorns are deceptive in that way. From a distance, the mountains can look open and approachable, but once you enter the backcountry, the landscape becomes much more complicated. Drainages twist through the forest, ridgelines block visibility, and the landscape can quickly make even familiar areas difficult to navigate. In terrain like that, being only a short distance away from a search team does not always mean being easy to find. And that's the thing about the Bighorns. Even people who know these mountains well understand they can still be dangerous. Experience helps, but changing weather, difficult terrain, and isolation can turn a familiar landscape into a dangerous one very quickly. The line about knowing something your whole life but never fully predicting it, I felt that one, and it's going to matter a lot here. Every fall, hunters head into the Bighorns knowing there are risks out there, and most of the time, everything goes exactly as planned. They go in, they hunt, and they come back home. But every now and then, something happens that reminds everyone just how unforgiving these mountains can be. In the spring of 2023, a combination of erosion, seasonal snowmelt, and unstable terrain likely contributed to a landslide in a remote drainage of the Bighorn Mountains. The slide altered a section of terrain that had been searched nearly a decade earlier, exposing areas that had previously been covered by rock and soil. Weeks later, once conditions allowed safe access, a Forest Service field crew entered the area to assess the damage and document how the landscape had changed. Their work involved examining displaced rock, erosion patterns, and changes to drainage features, routine assessments used to understand how natural events affect forest conditions and potential hazards. While documenting the disturbed area, a member of the Forest Service crew noticed material that appeared to be human remains among the displaced soil and rock. I can't imagine being that person out there doing routine erosion work, and suddenly you're not doing that job anymore. The crew immediately stopped work, secured the area, and contacted local authorities rather than disturbing the site further. Nearby, investigators recovered a heavily corroded hunting rifle and fragments of outdoor equipment consistent with a backcountry hunting trip. Although much of the material had deteriorated after years underground, some remaining items helped investigators identify a possible connection to Chervy. At first, the crew could not know how long the remains had been exposed or who they belonged to. In remote areas, discoveries like this require investigators to work carefully, documenting the scene before anything is moved. The location of the remains, surrounding debris, and any objects found nearby could all help reconstruct what happened years earlier. Word of the discovery moved through Buffalo quickly, once authorities confirmed that human remains had been found in that particular drainage. For a town like Buffalo, where many residents have strong connections to the surrounding mountains, news of the discovery quickly drew attention. It did not take long for people to connect the remains to one of the area's unresolved missing person cases. It took forensic analysis and DNA testing conducted by the Wyoming State Medical Examiner's Office to move from suspicion to confirmation. The results established that the remains belonged to Chervy Dawson, a hunter who had vanished into that same drainage in the fall of 2013 at the age of 47. By all accounts, Chervy was the kind of person who seemed rooted to Buffalo. He had spent most of his life there, growing up on a cattle ranch northwest of town before eventually building a career as an equipment mechanic. People who knew him described someone dependable and unassuming, the sort of man who showed up, did his work, and rarely drew attention to himself. Friends and relatives said he had been comfortable outdoors for as long as they could remember. Hunting had been part of his life since he was young, and by 2013, he had spent years returning to the same areas of the Bighorn Mountains. Those who knew Chervy described him as practical, patient, and self-reliant, someone who worked through problems carefully and took preparation seriously. He was not known as someone who chased unnecessary risks or made impulsive decisions in the backcountry. This is exactly the guy you'd think would be fine out there, which honestly makes it harder for me to hear. For someone who had lived in Buffalo most of his life, the Bighorns were less an unfamiliar wilderness than a landscape he had come to know through years of experience. He was divorced by then, though those close to him said the separation had not been marked by major conflict. He remained close with his adult son, and hunting was one of the interests they continued to share. Those who knew Chervy said he was careful about letting others know where he planned to be and when he expected to return. Investigators found no evidence indicating that Chervy had intentionally disappeared. That reputation would become one of the most perplexing aspects of the case. When word spread that Chervy had failed to return from a hunting trip, many of the people who knew him struggled to understand how someone so experienced and familiar with the terrain could simply disappear. I keep coming back to that. Everyone agrees he was the careful one, and yet here we are. The hunting trip Chervy began in October 2013 was not unusual for him. Family members said he often set aside time each fall to hunt elk in the Bighorn Mountains, returning to areas he had come to know through years of experience. According to those close to him, he had spent time in the mountains earlier that season and planned to return for a longer trip once elk season was underway. The area where he intended to hunt was located deep in the Bighorns, at elevations approaching 9,500 feet. Reaching it required traveling along a rough four-wheel drive road before continuing on foot into increasingly steep terrain. Maps, search records, and later accounts from rescue personnel describe the area as heavily forested, with dense stands of lodgepole pine broken by narrow drainages and rocky slopes that could be difficult to navigate even in good conditions. The terrain itself would become a recurring topic during the search. Search and rescue personnel later noted that parts of the drainage contained unstable talus fields and steep canyon walls, features that complicated both ground searches and aerial observation. Visibility was often limited by the landscape, making it difficult to see very far in any direction despite being in open mountain country. Weather was another concern. Archived forecasts from mid-October show nighttime temperatures in the high country falling well below freezing, while advisories issued later that week warned of deteriorating conditions and possible snowfall at higher elevations. In a region where weather can shift quickly, even experienced hunters understood that conditions could change dramatically over the course of a single day. Like much of the backcountry in the Bighorns, the area also lacked reliable cell coverage. Any emergency call for help would have been difficult to make, and assistance, if requested, would have taken considerable time to arrive. No cell coverage, plus talus fields, plus freezing nights, that combination alone is enough to worry me before anything even happens to him. As the search unfolded, investigators and rescue personnel would repeatedly point to the combination of rugged terrain, isolation, and changing weather as some of the most significant challenges facing anyone traveling through that part of the range. On the morning of October 14th, 2013, before heading into the backcountry, Chervy stopped by the Buffalo Ranger District Office, just like he had done during previous hunting trips. Before leaving Buffalo, he checked the conditions in the area and let people close to him know his planned route and when he expected to return. I always find moments like this interesting because it shows how normal everything felt at the time. Just someone doing the usual preparation before a trip. At the time, those details probably didn't seem important, but later on, once the search began, they would become some of the key pieces of information investigators relied on. And really, nothing about what Chervy shared that morning stood out as unusual. It was just what an experienced hunter would normally do before heading into the mountains. He had taken these kinds of precautions before, and this trip seemed no different. After leaving the ranger station, Chervy drove toward a trailhead that hunters commonly use to access that part of the Bighorn Mountains. As investigators started looking into what happened, they began piecing together Chervy's final known movements, using information he had shared before the trip and evidence later found in the mountains. Investigators later used the information he left behind, including his planned route and return date, to establish where he had entered the backcountry and where search efforts needed to begin. Along with the route and return information he had shared beforehand, these details gave investigators some of the clearest indications of where Chervy was and where he intended to go before he disappeared. From the trailhead, Chervy traveled several miles into the drainage before establishing his base camp in a clearing partially sheltered by surrounding timber. When search teams later located the site, they found his tent, food supplies, and equipment still in place. The camp showed that Chervy had entered the area as planned and prepared for a multi-day hunt, but it offered few answers about what happened after he left. There were no immediate signs of a disturbance that explained why he failed to return. I think there's something strangely quiet about seeing a campsite like this. All the gear still there, everything set up, but the person who brought it there is gone. What happened during the following days remains less certain. Investigators were able to establish where Chervy had planned to hunt, but the exact details of his movements after leaving camp were never fully known. Without direct witnesses or a complete record of his route, much of the timeline had to be reconstructed from the evidence left behind, the surrounding terrain, and information provided by people familiar with his hunting habits. On October 16th, 2 days into the trip, Chervy made a scheduled check-in with his longtime hunting partner, Russell Kepler. The two had arranged to stay in contact during the hunt, as they had on previous trips. Russell later told investigators that he had spoken with Chervy during that check-in. According to Russell's account, Chervy said he had spotted a bull elk moving through a canyon area away from his base camp and planned to follow it before losing daylight. For Russell, the conversation did not immediately stand out as unusual. He later described Chervy as sounding like he normally did during hunting trips, focused on the hunt and interested in the opportunity he had found. There was no indication during the exchange that Chervy was dealing with an emergency or believed he was in immediate danger. It would become the last confirmed communication anyone had with Chervy. He sounds completely normal on that call, just a guy excited about a bull elk, and that's honestly the hardest part for me to sit with. Several days passed without another check-in. Because Chervy was known to spend extended periods alone in the backcountry, and communication from remote mountain terrain could be inconsistent, Russell initially believed the silence might simply be the result of difficult conditions or limited signal coverage. That changed when October 21st arrived, the return date Chervy had given before leaving, and there was still no sign of him. His truck hadn't come back, and Russell hadn't received any message saying that Chervy was planning to stay longer or change his plans, and that was when the situation started to feel different. Based on what Russell knew about Chervy, this wasn't something he would normally do. Chervy was experienced, he was careful, and he understood the importance of letting people know where he was going and when he expected to be back. I can picture Russell just staring at that empty spot where the truck should be, and that's the moment that it stops being nothing. So Russell contacted the sheriff's office and the Forest Service. He provided them with everything he had: Chervy's planned route, his expected return date, details from their last conversation, and the canyon area Chervy had mentioned while talking about the elk he had seen. Those details, at the time, were some of the only clues available, but they would soon become the starting point for the search that followed. Search and rescue operations began after Russell reported that Chervy had failed to return. With information about his planned hunting area, a known base camp location, and details from that final check-in, search teams had a starting point for where to focus their efforts. Over the following days, the intensive search expanded to include ground crews, aerial searches, and volunteers from local search and rescue organizations, hunting communities, and people who knew Chervy personally. Search teams worked outward from the information they had: his planned route, his base camp location, and the area he had mentioned during his final conversation with Russell. The terrain itself made the search extremely challenging. Crews had to move through steep drainages, dense forest, and areas of uneven rock where visibility was limited. In some sections, searchers could cover only a small amount of ground each day because the landscape required them to move carefully over unstable slopes, thick vegetation, and areas where a person could be hidden only a short distance away. Search teams also faced the difficulty of knowing where to focus their efforts. They had Chervy's last known location, his planned hunting area, and the canyon he mentioned, but no confirmed route showing exactly how he traveled after leaving camp. In a landscape made up of countless gullies, ridges, and pockets of dense timber, even an experienced hunter could disappear into terrain that looked much smaller on a map than it felt on the ground. In the weeks that followed, crews continued targeted searches through the drainage and surrounding terrain, focusing on areas where an experienced hunter might have traveled. Search efforts were adjusted based on the evidence available, but without additional clues or a confirmed location, investigators were left with a large and difficult area to cover. Searchers first found Chervy's truck at the trailhead, where it was still parked and appeared undisturbed. There were no obvious signs that he had left in a hurry or that something had happened around the vehicle. As the search moved farther into the drainage, they eventually reached his base camp. The tent was still standing, and his gear and supplies were still there: food, sleeping equipment, and other items you would expect to see from someone planning to spend several days hunting in the area. And that detail was important. The condition of the camp suggested that Chervy had probably left it at some point during the trip, rather than simply packing up and leaving the mountains. But beyond that, the site didn't really provide many answers about where he went next. Seeing that tent still standing with his gear untouched, that's almost worse than finding nothing at all. Later, search teams working outward from the camp found a set of boot impressions near the entrance of the canyon Chervy had mentioned during his last conversation with Russell. Investigators noted that the impressions appeared consistent with the size and tread pattern of Chervy's boots, although they could not confirm his exact path or determine what happened after that point. The impressions continued toward the canyon before eventually disappearing in an area of exposed rock and loose talus. Unfortunately, that kind of terrain does not preserve tracks well. From there, searchers no longer had a clear trail to follow. He appears to be heading toward the same canyon area he mentioned to Russell, and then the ground itself just stops telling anyone anything. Canine search teams and aircraft supported the search effort, although the steep terrain, dense vegetation, and limited visibility made aerial and ground searches challenging. Despite the continued search efforts by professional rescuers, volunteers, and people familiar with the landscape, no additional signs of Chervy were located. No clothing, equipment, or remains were found that could explain what happened after he entered the canyon. Investigators considered several possible explanations for Chervy's disappearance based on the evidence available at the time. A fall or accident in the canyon was one of the leading possibilities, given the steep terrain, exposed rock, and difficult conditions in the area where he was last believed to have traveled. Weather was another concern. Temperatures in the high country could drop well below freezing at night, and changing conditions during that time of year added another layer of risk for anyone traveling alone in the mountains. Officials also considered the possibility of a wildlife encounter, although there was no evidence at the time pointing directly toward one. Without recovered remains, personal equipment, or additional evidence beyond the tracks near the canyon, investigators could not determine exactly what had happened. After weeks of searching with no new leads, the active operation was eventually scaled back, leaving the case unresolved. For Chervy's family and friends, the end of the search brought no clear explanation, only the knowledge that somewhere in the Bighorn Mountains, he had disappeared without leaving behind enough evidence to tell them why. Weeks of searching, and all they have is a set of tracks that just vanish. In the years that followed, Chervy's disappearance became a lingering mystery in and around Buffalo. Like many unresolved cases in close-knit communities, people continued to search for explanations even when investigators had few answers to offer. Some believe the most likely explanation was the mountain itself. They pointed to the steep terrain, remote location, and difficult conditions in the Bighorns as enough to explain how an experienced hunter could disappear without leaving behind obvious evidence. Others in the community discussed different possibilities, including whether Chervy might have encountered another person in the backcountry. Over time, various theories circulated among people familiar with the area, including possibilities involving other people being present in the backcountry. However, investigators found no evidence connecting anyone else to Chervy's disappearance. A smaller number of people questioned whether Chervy could have chosen to leave voluntarily, though investigators found no evidence supporting that theory. Like the other possibilities raised over the years, it remained speculation rather than an explanation. Ultimately, none of these theories produced new leads, and Chervy's disappearance remained unresolved. What remained consistent in the years after Chervy disappeared was his son's determination to keep searching for answers. In interviews over the years, he spoke about returning to the Bighorn Mountains and revisiting areas connected to his father's disappearance, hoping that something missed during the original search might eventually provide a clue. His continued searches reflected his hope that, eventually, something might finally explain what happened to his father. Every time he went back into the mountains, he carried that same uncertainty with him, the feeling that maybe something had been missed, or that some small piece of evidence was still out there waiting to be found. A son going back year after year into the exact mountains that took his father. I don't know how you carry that, but he did it anyway. But year after year, the Bighorns stayed quiet. For nearly a decade, there were no new answers, and Chervy's disappearance remained an open mystery despite the searches and efforts to find him. Then, in the spring of 2023, that silence was finally broken. A natural event in the mountains exposed a section of terrain that had remained hidden for years, leading to a discovery that would finally bring answers to Chervy's family. During the response to the landslide, a Forest Service crew discovered human remains in the area. The remains were later identified through forensic analysis and DNA testing as belonging to Chervy Dawson. Following that identification, the case was reviewed by forensic investigators and medical authorities. The examination found skeletal injuries consistent with a significant traumatic event, supporting the possibility that Chervy died from an accident, such as a fall. However, after nearly a decade in the mountain environment, the condition of the remains made it impossible to determine the exact circumstances surrounding his death. Investigators found no evidence suggesting that another person had been involved in Chervy's death. The forensic examination also did not uncover findings that supported the theories of foul play or a planned disappearance that had circulated in the years after he went missing. 10 years of theories about other people or him just walking away, and it came back to the explanation investigators had never been able to prove: a likely accident in steep terrain. Using the forensic findings, Russell Kepler's account of Chervy's final communication, and the possible boot impressions documented during the original 2013 search, investigators developed a likely explanation based on the evidence that remained available. Taken together, the available evidence suggested that Chervy likely traveled toward the canyon area mentioned during his final conversation and may have suffered a fatal accident in the surrounding terrain. The injuries identified during the forensic examination were consistent with such an accident, while the location of the remains within the disturbed terrain was consistent with the possibility that natural processes, including erosion and slope movement, had altered the area over time. However, the exact circumstances of his final moments could never be determined. The discovery also helped explain why the original search had not located him. Over nearly a decade, natural changes in the terrain, including erosion, shifting debris, and seasonal movement of rock and soil, may have altered the area enough that evidence remained hidden until the landslide exposed it. It was only after the 2023 landslide altered the terrain that investigators were able to locate remains connected to Chervy's disappearance. This happened on October 14, 2017, up on the Pennsylvania stretch of the Appalachian Trail near Bake Oven Knob. The temperature was hanging in the mid-50s, but out here, everyone knew the deal. As soon as the sun dipped, that cold would hit hard and fast. The trees were mostly bare, leaving the rocky ground hidden under a thick, crunchy layer of dry leaves, the kind that look great in a photo but make it impossible to see the loose, shifty shale waiting underneath. If you've never been, you have to understand that the Appalachian Trail isn't just some dirt path. It's a 2,000-mile legend that snakes from Georgia to Maine, and that Saturday, the trail was humming. It had the kind of busy rhythm you'd expect on a fall weekend. Day hikers were finishing afternoon loops, backpackers were trying to reach the next shelter before dark, and voices drifted through the trees every few minutes. It felt like one of those places where you're rarely completely alone. One of the people out there was 34-year-old Michelle Edelman, a mechanical engineer from Pittsburgh. But to her followers, she wasn't just an engineer. She was an outdoor influencer who built her brand on her outdoor adventures. 5 days a week, she was chained to a desk solving technical problems, and she made sure her audience saw the contrast. Her feed was a curated collection of fresh air, quiet miles, and perfectly framed shots of the trail disappearing into the trees. So for Michelle, the Appalachian Trail wasn't just a hobby. It was her content, her escape, and her identity. And that contrast came with a quiet kind of pressure. Her social media showed a consistent pattern of solo weekend hikes. Friends said hiking alone was simply how she preferred to explore the trail. Nobody was expecting a call from her until Sunday night. That gap, the one her whole audience assumed was normal, was about to matter more than anyone realized. Michelle wasn't trying to thru-hike the whole thing. She was a section hiker. She'd drive out, hike a section of the trail, take a few good photos, and be back at work on Monday. She'd been doing this for 3 years and had the routine dialed in. She knew how to pace herself, how to prepare for long trail days, and how to document her hikes for the people who followed her online. And she wasn't a beginner either. We need to understand that. Her pack was loaded with exactly what you'd expect from someone who knows their way around the backcountry. A paper map, phone, a solid headlamp, extra layers, high-end food, a water filter, and reliable trekking poles. She was fully prepared. Nothing about her gear or the way she prepped her followers for the trip suggested that this Saturday was going to end any differently from the dozens of successful hikes she'd already posted. People who knew her said she wasn't the type to sit still for long. Not restless in a bad way, just someone who needed a reason to move. Friends said if you asked her what she was doing that weekend, half the time the answer involved a trailhead somewhere. She wasn't chasing anything big or trying to prove a point. She just liked being outside, and the trail gave her an easy way to do that without a lot of planning. That Saturday started exactly like most of her weekend treks. Michelle pulled her car over near the base of Bake Oven Knob, just north of Germansville, Pennsylvania. If you've never been there, imagine this: a jagged spine of white quartzite rock cutting through the Appalachian Mountains. It's earned a reputation among hikers for being one of the most stunning and brutal stretches of the entire Appalachian Trail. The overlooks offer sweeping views across the surrounding valleys, making the whole place look peaceful from a distance. Down on the trail, though, it's a completely different experience. The terrain is rough, rocky, narrow, and relentlessly uneven. Every few steps, another loose rock demands your attention. You don't spend much time looking at the view because you're too busy watching your feet, carefully picking your way across sharp quartzite stones and hoping you don't roll an ankle. That reputation catches a lot of hikers off guard because the elevation itself isn't what wears you down. It's the constant interruption to your rhythm. On easier sections of the Appalachian Trail, you settle into a steady pace without thinking much about where your feet land. Bake Oven Knob doesn't let you do that. Every few steps, another cluster of uneven rocks forces you to stop, adjust your footing, and carefully choose where to place your weight. Covering a single mile here can easily take much longer than hikers expect, even for people with years of experience. That's why even experienced hikers usually plan fewer miles here than the map suggests. The morning started like any other pleasant fall day, with the temperature hovering in the mid-50s. It felt comfortable enough that it was easy to forget how different the mountains become after sunset. Once the light faded, the temperature was expected to drop quickly into the upper 30s, and the combination of cool air, damp ground, and a steady breeze could leave an exhausted hiker dangerously cold in just a few hours. Michelle's plan was simple enough: reach the shelter before dark. It wasn't an ambitious goal. It was simply how most hikers planned this stretch of the Appalachian Trail. If you've ever hiked in Pennsylvania, you already know its reputation. We call it Rocksylvania for a reason. It's not steep in some dramatic, mountainous way, it's just relentless. Every single step requires a deliberate decision. Your ankles and knees do more work there than almost anywhere else on the entire Appalachian Trail. It slowly wears you down. Every step takes a little more attention than you expect, and before long, you're moving much slower than you planned. And that's exactly what started happening to Michelle. For the first several hours, there wasn't a single reason to believe anything was wrong. She moved at a steady, practiced pace, checking the map now and then and glancing up for those white blazes, those little white rectangles painted on trees and rocks that guide you along the entire Appalachian Trail. As long as you can see one blaze and then the next one after it, you're fine. That's the entire system. Simple, right? It's worked for decades. But the rock fields slowed her down much more than she expected. Instead of a smooth, packed dirt path where you can zone out and think, it was constant high-stakes foot placement. The trail rarely lets your eyes wander. Every step forces you to stop and think, is this rock actually going to hold me? After hours of doing that, your legs get tired, your ankles start aching, and you realize you've lost far more time than you expected. Nothing investigators found suggested Michelle had taken unnecessary risks. If anything, the evidence showed she had been careful. She slowed down whenever the footing looked uncertain. The problem was that every careful step cost a little more time. By late afternoon, daylight was fading, and she still had miles left. Around that time, Michelle was passed by a backpacking couple heading north. During interviews with investigators, they remembered the encounter because everyone hiking that stretch seemed to be talking about how slow the rocky terrain had been that afternoon. They exchanged a few friendly words before continuing in opposite directions. The couple later said Michelle looked tired, but otherwise appeared well-equipped and in good spirits. Nothing about the encounter suggested she was injured, lost, or in any immediate danger. It would become one of the last confirmed sightings of her before she disappeared. The couple later told investigators they remembered Michelle asking if the shelter was much farther ahead. They pointed her in the right direction and continued hiking. She thanked them, smiled, and kept walking. Neither of them noticed anything unusual about her. It was such a normal conversation that they didn't think about it again until they saw news of the search a few days later. After speaking with other hikers and reviewing Michelle's recent social media activity, investigators believed she was likely trying to reach the shelter before dark, just as she had originally planned. Whether she felt pressure to stay on schedule is impossible to know. What is certain is that daylight was fading while she still had distance left to cover. A reliable water source was located near the shelter she was heading toward. Rather than stop earlier to filter water, she continued hiking, a decision many experienced backpackers make when they expect to reach camp before dark. Then the light started to shift. You know how a room slowly gets darker before you notice the sun is setting? The woods are like that. The sky can still look bright overhead, but down on the trail, everything starts turning gray. Rocks, roots, and leaves begin looking almost the same. As daylight faded, spotting the white trailblazes would have become progressively more difficult beneath the forest canopy. At that point, Michelle remained on the marked trail, carrying the equipment she normally used on weekend hikes. At that point, nothing suggested she was in trouble. She was still on the marked trail with the gear she always carried. Other hikers were nearby, moving between shelters and road crossings, and everything looked completely normal. Several days after Michelle was reported missing, another hiker contacted investigators after recognizing her photo in the news. He remembered passing her near a bend in the trail overlooking the hillside below. Michelle had paused a few feet off the main path, looking down the slope. Assuming she was admiring the view or deciding where to take a photo, he simply nodded as he walked past and continued toward the shelter. By the time he rounded the next bend, Michelle was out of sight. He never saw what happened after that. That brief encounter became the last confirmed sighting of Michelle alive. Investigators never determined exactly what caused her to leave the marked trail after that point. Sometime after that final sighting, Michelle left the marked trail. Whether she mistook an opening in the trees for an easier route, followed what appeared to be a faint footpath, or simply misjudged the terrain below could never be determined. The physical evidence only showed where she went, not why. Investigators later retraced the area where the hiker had last seen Michelle. They found no signs of a struggle or sudden fall near the trail itself. Whatever happened next occurred after she was no longer visible to anyone walking along the ridge. Based on where investigators later found disturbed leaves, broken vegetation, and slide marks, they believed Michelle stepped off the white blazed trail and started downhill. It wasn't an immediate fall, and it wasn't an injury. Exactly what happened during those first moments off the trail could never be determined. At some point, for reasons investigators could never fully determine, she left the marked path. That single decision ultimately placed her on unstable ground from which she could not recover. According to the terrain investigators documented, the first section below the trail was relatively gentle, with scattered leaves and low brush covering the hillside. Farther downslope, however, the terrain became noticeably steeper and less stable. The physical evidence suggested she continued descending before reaching the unstable shale farther below. Investigators believe that after leaving the trail, Michelle eventually lost sight of the white blazes. From lower on the hillside, the marked path would have been hidden by the angle of the slope, scattered boulders, and the thick stand of trees between her and the ridgeline. What had started as a short detour had quietly become a much bigger problem. However, one of the challenges of leaving a marked trail is that the surrounding forest often looks nearly identical to the trail itself. The difference usually becomes apparent only when someone attempts to return. Those first few steps look almost identical to the ones you just left behind. It's only when you try to turn back that you see the difference. The slope consisted largely of loose shale covered by dry leaves, making it difficult to maintain stable footing. The recovery team later documented disturbed shale and broken vegetation scattered across the slope. Those physical signs suggested Michelle repeatedly attempted to climb back toward the trail before eventually sliding back down the unstable hillside. Investigators found evidence that Michelle repeatedly tried climbing back toward the trail. Disturbed shale and broken plants showed where the hillside kept giving way beneath her. Even with trekking poles, that loose shale offered almost nothing solid to stand on. Below her, years of rainfall had cut a shallow channel into the side of the mountain. Up near the top, it looked like just dirt and leaves angled, sure, but manageable. But further down, it narrowed into this tight, deceptive bowl choked with loose stone and exposed roots. It's the kind of spot that looks solid enough from a distance, but as the investigators noted, the terrain literally falls apart the second you put any real weight on it. The drainage formed a natural trap. As it narrowed, nearly every possible route out required climbing unstable shale. Several sections of the hillside appeared climbable, with exposed roots and small rock ledges offering what looked like secure handholds. Investigators later concluded those features were misleading. Beneath the layer of dry leaves, the loose shale shifted under even moderate weight, causing each climbing attempt to fail. As darkness settled across the ridge, navigating the drainage would have become increasingly difficult. The headlamp she carried illuminated only a few feet at a time, making stable rock and loose shale almost impossible to distinguish. By then, the marked trail remained physically close, but visually and practically out of reach. Evidence at the recovery site suggested Michelle attempted to climb one of the steeper sections of the drainage, using exposed roots and rock ledges as handholds. In daylight, those features appeared usable. Under the narrow beam of a headlamp, they were far less reliable than they looked. Disturbed shale and slide marks suggested Michelle repeatedly attempted to climb the slope before sliding back into the drainage. The disturbed ground suggested Michelle made several attempts to climb out. Each attempt loosened more shale, making the slope even harder to climb. When her footing failed, she slid back into the deep, dark drainage. Each unsuccessful attempt left her farther from the trail than before. Trekking poles are effective on stable ground, but provide limited support on loose shale, where the tips can slide or sink beneath leaves. Trekking poles work well on firm ground, but on loose shale, they provide very little support. Investigators believe the unstable surface would have made climbing extremely difficult, even with proper hiking equipment. Investigators found disturbed dirt, broken plants, and slide marks on one section of the slope, indicating Michelle slipped while trying to climb. The exact sequence of movements could never be reconstructed, but the evidence showed she lost her footing on the unstable hillside. Evidence suggested that during one of those climbing attempts, she suffered a significant fall onto the rocky drainage below, leaving her with injuries that prevented her from climbing any farther. At some point during those climbing attempts, Michelle suffered a significant fall onto the rocky drainage below. The injuries documented during the recovery were consistent with a hard impact against the uneven terrain and ultimately left her unable to climb out. The medical examiner documented severe injuries to her lower extremities consistent with a fall onto rocky terrain. Those injuries would have made climbing the steep hillside extremely difficult, if not impossible. Her gear was scattered. One trekking pole was further down the drainage, and the other was half buried in leaves. Her flashlight was found broken a few feet away from her. Her phone was still there. The screen had cracked in the fall, and although it could still power on, there was no signal. The situation changed instantly. After suffering the fall, Michelle's injuries prevented her from climbing back toward the trail. Her documented injuries made further climbing extremely difficult. The trail was just yards away, but she couldn't reach it. She couldn't walk, and that took away any chance of saving herself. The terrain made things worse. If you've never been in a deep drainage like that, it's hard to explain. The shape of the ground, the thick brush, and the wind likely swallowed her voice. If she called for help after the fall, the shape of the drainage, thick brush, and the evening wind likely kept those calls from reaching anyone on the trail above. She couldn't get a signal either. In these steep areas, cell towers are easily blocked by the mountains. She never managed to place an emergency call, which is just a brutal reality of the backcountry. You think you're connected until you actually need to be. Now, she could only rely on her voice. Investigators believe she may have called for help after the fall. No hikers reported hearing anyone in distress, likely because the shape of the drainage, thick vegetation, and evening wind scattered or muffled sound before it reached the trail above. She may have tried to crawl a little way along the bottom of the drainage. Investigators found scuff marks and kicked up leaves, which suggested some movement after the fall, but there just wasn't a way out. The temperature dropped as the night went on. Now, a hiker who can still walk can usually survive a cold night by moving around and keeping their blood flowing, but Michelle couldn't do that. Because of her injuries, Michelle could no longer move effectively around the drainage. Overnight exposure, limited mobility, and falling temperatures significantly increased her risk of hypothermia. By the following morning, hikers were again using the trail above, unaware that Michelle was somewhere below them in the drainage. The slope and dense trees concealed the area from view, and no one realized she had left the marked trail. Although hikers continued using the trail above the following morning, the steep drainage and dense vegetation concealed Michelle from view. One of the most striking aspects of the case is how close Michelle remained to the trail. Although the horizontal distance was short, the terrain between her location and the marked path made reaching her far more difficult than the map alone would suggest. When Michelle's sister didn't hear from her by Sunday evening, she knew something was wrong and reported her overdue. She had left a trip plan, which helped searchers narrow down the general area, but they didn't have a specific location. That is the scary reality of hiking alone. Once you're off the map, you're basically a ghost. Search teams first focused on the places where missing hikers are usually found. They checked shelters, nearby road crossings, overlooks, and obvious side trails. Once she could no longer move around, staying warm became almost impossible. As the temperature kept dropping through the night, hypothermia became an increasing risk. It wasn't until teams began systematically examining the drainages beneath the ridge that the search finally started moving in the right direction. Nobody had seen her since Saturday afternoon. Search teams started at the shelter she was headed toward, but she wasn't there. Her car was still at the trailhead, confirming she had started the hike, but after that, there was just a massive empty gap. It's frustrating and sad to realize how thin the margin is between being found and being lost. One bad step is all it takes to go from a person on a hike to someone the world can no longer see, even when they're right nearby. Search crews started by checking the main trail and side paths, calling out for Michelle. This is standard protocol for a missing hiker. Usually someone is just running behind schedule or has a minor injury and they're easy to find, but this time it didn't help. They searched the trail, but Michelle had fallen off the ridge into the drainage below. From the trail, nothing looked unusual. The hillside looked like every other stretch of forest along that ridge. There was no obvious sign that someone had fallen below it. Checking her phone records didn't help either. The steep terrain and poor cell service meant there was no useful location data to track. As the search grew to include areas away from shelters and trail junctions, teams started looking at the steep drainages below the ridge. Eventually, they found signs of disturbed ground leading away from the path. This finally gave them a clear area to focus on. The rescuers had to climb down into those drainages, which was a dangerous job. They had to deal with the exact same unstable ground that trapped Michelle. The team had to move slowly, using ropes for safety, and carefully navigating the loose shale so they didn't end up needing a rescue themselves. Even for trained rescuers, moving through that terrain was dangerous. They had to use ropes, move one careful step at a time, and avoid triggering the same loose shale that had trapped Michelle. Air-sent search dogs were later deployed to help cover terrain below the ridge that ground teams could not safely search as quickly. But even with that extra help, the terrain slowed everything down. A search like this isn't just about covering distance. It's about covering distance safely, without adding more people to the list of folks who might get hurt on that same unstable slope. They found Michelle on the third day. She was less than 300 yards from the Appalachian Trail. That's a tiny distance on a map, but the steep slope, the loose rock, and the heavy brush made it impossible for rescuers to reach her quickly. Getting her out was incredibly difficult. Rescuers had to descend carefully using ropes and secure anchor points while navigating the same unstable shale that had trapped Michelle. Every step had to be deliberate to avoid causing additional slides. It was slow, dangerous work. The medical examiner ruled her death accidental. She died from injuries sustained in the fall, with prolonged exposure and hypothermia contributing after she became stranded on the mountainside. The evidence was clear: the disturbed ground, the broken plants, the scattered gear, and her position in the drainage. Her phone was there, but it didn't have a signal. Investigators never determined exactly what caused Michelle to leave the marked trail. What they could reconstruct from the scene was enough to explain how a short distance became impossible to cross. Looking back, there wasn't one big mistake that caused everything. It was a series of small ones. The rocky trail slowed her down, daylight faded, She was trying to reach water before stopping for the night. Somewhere along the way, she left the marked trail for reasons no one will ever know. After that, the mountain did the rest. 300 yards. That's the whole story. It's not the distance she hiked, it's the distance between her and the people who could have helped her after she became stranded below the trail. It really makes you realize how thin the line is between a hike and a tragedy. It was the evening of October 21st, 2022, high in the backcountry of the Inyo National Forest in the Eastern Sierra, well past the last trail sign and the last bar of service, when two young women had lost the way back. The last of the light was going, the temperature was already falling, and nobody knew exactly where to come looking for them. Cameron Delgado was 24 and Rachel Ocampo was 23, and together they ran a travel account that had grown into a real career, the kind with brand deals and a few 100,000 followers who watched them find quiet lakes most people never hear about. Cameron was the engine of the whole thing, the bold one, the one who pushed for the bigger shot and the harder to reach spot, the one whose face the camera loved. Rachel was the careful one, the planner, the friend who packed the snacks and read the comments and worried quietly about the things Cameron waved off. Their whole brand was the hidden spot, the place with no crowd and no ticket booth, the little corner of the map that everyone else had somehow missed. They were good at it. They were fit and photogenic, they hiked most weekends, and they had built an audience on making the outdoors look easy, beautiful, and open to anyone. What they had never built underneath all of that was true backcountry experience, the boring kind that keeps you alive once conditions turn bad. They balanced each other mostly. For 3 years, Rachel's caution had canceled out Cameron's nerve, and the two of them had come home safe every time, which is its own kind of trap because 100 trips that all end fine can teach you the wrong lesson about the 101st. Most of what investigators later understood came from 3 places: the videos they recorded, the hikers who saw them that afternoon, and Rachel's unsent messages recovered from the phone. The rest had to be reconstructed from where they were found, the weather, and the condition of the scene. There is a whole genre of this now, and it is worth understanding because it is what led them out there in the first place. Somewhere in the last few years, the internet fell in love with the secret spot, the unmarked lake, the overlook you can only reach if you know a guy who knows a guy. People stopped following trails and started following screenshots. They would see 30 seconds of turquoise water under gray peaks, save the clip, cross-reference it against a map, and set off cross-country to find it, with no path to follow and no one to ask. It looks like adventure and it films great, but it strips away every safety net a marked, maintained trail is built to give you. Cameron and Rachel were good at that game. They had won it a dozen times. That was the problem. Every trip they took raised the stakes for the next one. The lake at the end of a nice, easy trail was not content anymore because 1,000 other accounts already had that exact shot. The whole game rewarded going further and higher and later and more alone than the person before you, and it kept right on rewarding the two of them for it, all the way up until the one afternoon that it did not. The trip started, like all of their trips did, as pure content. There are clips of the two of them loading the car before dawn on no sleep, gas station coffee in hand, hyping up a place they would only ever call the most underrated lake in California, a spot they were plainly obsessed with and had been building toward all year. In one video from the long drive up, windows down and the music going, the caption jokes that the best places are always the ones that are hardest to reach, the whole clip playful and sure. The sound of two people certain the day already belongs to them. Then comes their running bit about gatekeepers, the people who find a gorgeous spot and then refuse to say where it is, and the two of them cast themselves as the generous opposite, promising to finally hand their followers the full location and everything. And then the hook that reeled a couple 100,000 people in, the promise that by that night they would have the shot of the entire year, along with a plea to keep watching and turn notifications on. They had made that exact promise a dozen times before, and a dozen times it had come true, and nothing on earth teaches you to tune out your own quiet fear quite like being proven right over and over again. I need you to understand who these two were. They were not totally careless idiots. They were fit and clever and experienced at this, and that competence is exactly what walked them straight into it. The lake they were chasing sat at a little over 10,500 feet, tucked into a granite bowl, a long way past the end of the maintained trail, the kind of place you only reach by picking your way cross-country over rock and loose scree for the better part of a mile. It had blown up online that summer, one viral clip of impossibly blue water, under bare gray peaks, and ever since then people had been trying to work out exactly where it was. Cameron and Rachel had a screenshot of a stranger's photo and a rough sense of the compass direction, and that, more or less, was the entire plan. They left no plan with anyone, no note on the dashboard, nothing anyone could hand to searchers if they did not come back. They started hiking in the early afternoon, hours later than anyone who knew that country would ever have set out, because they wanted the light to be soft and gold by the time they arrived. Between the two of them, they carried a little water, a few snacks, thin, fashionable clothes chosen for how they would read on camera rather than how they would hold heat, no headlamp, no map on paper, nothing that would count as real insulation for a night out. And although each of them carried a phone, they were filming everything on Rachel's, while Cameron sat dead in the bottom of the pack from the drive up, a backup nobody had thought to charge. Rachel's phone was doing everything at once: their map, their camera, and their only link to the whole rest of the world. Once the sun dropped behind the ridge, they would be crossing open rock by the dim glow of that same screen they could not afford to waste. They carried almost none of the plain, boring gear that turns a bad night out into an uncomfortable little story instead of a fatal one. No space blanket, no lighter, no power bank, no dry layer to change into, no whistle, no way to make heat or light or noise. What they had was a following, and a following does not keep you warm. Rachel texted her older sister from the road that morning, the way she always did at the start of a trip. She wrote that they were finally on their way, that she was doing the lake she had been obsessed with for a month, that she had barely slept and had been counting down the days, her excitement running through every line of it. She admitted they had gotten a much later start than she wanted, and that the drive was turning out far longer than it had looked, but Cam was dead set on the golden sunset light, so they were just gonna push on. Then came the part her sister would end up rereading 100 times over, a warning that the service was going to vanish the second they got up into the high country, so she should not worry if Rachel went quiet for a day or so, since that was completely normal out there. She signed off telling her sister that she loved her and promising a flood of photos the moment she had a single bar again. It read like every other bright, slightly frantic little message she ever fired off at the start of a trip, and that ordinariness is exactly the thing that makes it so hard to read now. Here's the part city people never believe, that shocked me even when I found out. A warm afternoon up there can turn into a devastating night that kills you. The Inyo National Forest is not a tame little park with railings and a gift shop and a ranger around every bend. It is close to 2 million acres of some of the steepest, emptiest country in the lower 48. Bare granite and thin, dry air where the trails run out, and the nearest paved road can be many hours of walking away. Up high, the weather turns with no warning. A warm blue afternoon flipping into wind, low cloud, and scattered sleet or wet snow in under an hour. The nights are bitterly cold, even in summer, and in October, at that elevation, the temperature drops far below freezing and can fall into the teens once the wind picks up. The dark comes fast and early too, the sun dropping behind the high western ridge a good hour before it sets, so the ground drops into shadow while the sky overhead is still bright. It is, in the simplest terms, a place that punishes exactly one thing: being out in it with no way to call for help and nobody who knows where you are. Cold does not care about your fitness, and it does not care how many miles you have hiked before this one. It works on the confident and the timid at the same rate. People have died within sight of a trailhead, and others a hard, cold mile past the last marker, and the ones who do not come back are rarely the ones you would have picked out in the parking lot. The last clips they managed to upload went up on the way in, while they still had a thread of signal near the trailhead, and they are almost unbearable to watch now. There are the two of them out on the trail in the afternoon sun, breathless and grinning. In one, Cameron spins the camera down toward the dusty pull-off far below them, and jokes about a creepy guy in an old truck who had sat there watching them gear up, calling it full horror movie energy before she cracks up, shivers, and keeps on climbing. In another, she pans across the empty basin. She marvels at how quiet it is, how they have not seen another living soul in hours, how the whole basin feels like it belongs to just the two of them, framing that emptiness as the entire point, the exact reason they chased the hard, scary hikes instead of the easy ones. They meant every bit of it as the dream, as the whole reason to envy them, and every word of it was also the danger, just said out loud and mistaken for the reward. That is the cruel trick of this kind of content, that everything going right and everything going wrong can look almost exactly the same, right up until the second it does not. That one offhand joke about the man in the truck would go on to haunt this entire case in a way that had almost nothing to do with what happened. For months afterward, strangers online were absolutely certain that he was the answer. The creepy man from the last video, the stranger lurking back at the trailhead, the villain the story seemed to need. It is the explanation people reach for first, because a bad man is easier to accept than the truth. But there was never a single shred of evidence that he followed them or spoke to them or ever laid eyes on them again after that parking lot. He is not the reason they died. What killed Cameron and Rachel that afternoon was the cold and how late and unprepared they walked into it, not a stranger in a truck. The people who actually saw them last were not sinister at all. Earlier that same afternoon, lower down on the way in, Cameron and Rachel had passed a small group of hikers who were already heading back toward the trailhead. Those hikers came forward afterward, and a lot of what we know about that afternoon on the ground comes from them. They remembered the two girls clearly, moving up fast and cheerful and filming as they climbed, dressed in light clothes with small day packs, far later in the day than made any sense for a spot that far out. One of them mentioned that the weather was supposed to turn and that they themselves were already calling it a day, and got the feeling the girls had no intention of doing the same. The hikers did not know exactly where Cameron and Rachel were headed, only that it was somewhere up and off the maintained trail. But they could pin down the last time anyone saw the two of them alive, and they could describe in plain detail just how little the two were carrying for what was coming.
Something I keep circling back to is how long they lingered for the shot. They spent the safe daylight hours on a photo, and up there, that daylight was the only thing keeping them alive.
They did reach the lake, and for a little while, it was everything they had promised it would be. There is footage, recovered later off the phone, of the two of them at the water in the last of the gold light, the bare peaks burning orange behind them, both of them laughing. Cameron narrates over it, breathless, saying it was worth every step, that some places are so unreal they barely look like a real photo, that this was hands down the best day of the entire year, and nothing in her voice carries even a trace of worry about the hour. Off camera, Rachel says something about the time. Cameron only waves her off, insisting they have got tons of time and that the light is perfect right now, just one more shot. They filmed up there far too long, chasing every angle while the light did the slow, soft thing it does right before it goes, and in the last clip they ever filmed, the shadows are already long and blue and cold across the granite. If you know that country, you can see the whole problem sitting in the frame before either of them did, and you want to reach in and tell them to leave the shot and just start walking down, but the light was perfect, and the water was empty, and they had come so far, so they stayed, and they filmed, and they stayed a little while longer still. By the time they packed up and turned back for the car, the light was going fast, and the way down was nothing like the way up. Off the maintained trail, out on open granite in the failing light, there is no obvious path, only a vague general direction, and in the flat blue dusk, one broad slope of rock looks just like the next and the one after. They got turned around. The phone that was their only map had been filming almost without a break all afternoon. Its battery was now down to the last sliver, and the cold was draining what little remained even faster. They had saved no offline maps, assuming, like a lot of casual hikers, that the map would keep working even after the service was gone, so with no signal and a dying phone, it was no help to them, let alone a lifeline. Somewhere in the descent, the afternoon weather shifted, clouds drifting over the ridge and a hard, cold wind coming up behind them, a squall of graupel and wet snow blowing through that soon left their thin clothes soaked, and the temperature started to plummet. They were in thin clothes, in the dark, shaking, with a dying phone and no earthly idea which direction the car was. They tried to retrace their steps and only pushed deeper into the maze of identical rock. They tried the phone one last time, and it died for good. With it went their map, their compass, their light, and their only way to call for help. The last real record of that night is a string of texts Rachel wrote her sister and never once managed to send, each one stuck and undelivered. The first one is almost calm, telling her sister they are fine, just a little turned around and not to panic. Then, shakier, she admits they stayed far too long and started down far too late, and that everything up there now looks exactly the same in the dark, until she can no longer tell which way is which. Then, slower and further apart, she writes that there is still no service, not one single bar, that the cold is setting in hard, and that Cam has gone quiet and stopped joking, which is starting to scare her. Then, a bit later, she says her hands are shaking too hard to type properly, and that her feet no longer feel like her own. Then comes the practical little ask that guts you, a plea for her sister to call the sheriff first thing in the morning if she has not heard from them, just in case, telling her that she loves her. And then, last of all, the decision to hunker down and wait for first light, the move Rachel tells herself is the smart one, the thing the two of them will surely laugh about someday. The messages get shorter and shakier and further apart as the long night grinds on, every one of them trying to send and failing and trying again. You can almost watch the exact moment the whole trip stops being an adventure and it does not happen in the words, it happens in the growing gaps between them.
By the time they understood they were in real trouble, the only immediate way they had left to call for help was a dead phone in a dead zone, and I keep thinking about how terrifying that would be.
What happened the rest of that night is not really a mystery, because the cold up there does the same thing to unprepared people almost every time. Badly underdressed at that elevation in that wind, the body loses heat faster than it can make it, and hypothermia sets in. The way it progresses is well documented. The body wears down, thinking slows, and the hands stop working, so people make worse and worse decisions, and often do not realize it is happening. Somewhere in the dark, on that loose rock, at least one of them likely fell, which is common when you are cold and stumbling downhill with no light, and even a minor injury out there can end any chance of walking out. From the way they were later found, they stopped moving and got down low together against the cold to wait for first light, which was still hours away. There was no struggle at the end and nothing to fight. The cold simply kept working, hour after hour, on two people who had been at a lake taking photos earlier that same day.
Picture the two of them in the dark, soaked and freezing and holding onto each other, waiting for a rescue that no one had even been told to send. That's why I made this.
Back home, at first, the silence did not frighten anybody, and that quiet delay is its own small and separate tragedy. The two of them dropped off the grid for a day or two all the time, chasing spots with no service and saving posts to edit and drip out later, so a quiet day from the account was completely normal. But then Cameron missed a paid shoot that she never in a million years would have missed, and Rachel did not turn up for her shift and did not call in, and neither of them answered a call or text or message from anyone, and slowly the ordinary quiet turned into real worry. Their family started working the phones, and they ran straight into the same problem the two of them had already run into. Nobody knew exactly where they had gone. The posts had only ever said the Eastern Sierra, vaguely, on purpose to protect the precious secret. The single most viewed video of the entire trip had cheerfully told hundreds of thousands of complete strangers to keep watching, and had told not one of them where to look. Every hour the account stayed quiet was another hour lost, and not one person watching had any way of knowing it.
People assume that if you vanish out there, help comes right away, and I wish that were true. A search can't even start until someone notices you're gone, and by then, it was almost always too late.
When the search finally did begin, it was enormous, and it was close to hopeless from the first hour. The Inyo County Sheriff's Office led the search with its volunteer search and rescue teams and the Forest Service assisting trained volunteers, combing the ground, and a helicopter working the high drainages from the air, and they were handed the worst problem in that line of work: 2 missing people somewhere in 2 million acres. With no confirmed trailhead, no route filed with a soul, only the vague name of an enormous stretch of backcountry. The first real break came from the videos. Investigators pulled the landmarks from their own clips to work out which of the dozens of access points the two had most likely used, and deputies sent to check those trailheads found the car. That gave them a starting point, but only that. From there, they kept working backward from the tiny scraps the footage gave them, the distinctive shapes of the peaks in the backgrounds, the color and texture of the granite, the angle of the setting sun, and slowly narrowed the impossible haystack down toward the cluster of lakes in one high basin. It still took days, because even with the trailhead, the two had gone miles off trail and cross country into ground that all looks the same. And with every hour that slid past, every last person out there searching understood a little more clearly what it was they were now going to find. Family members drove up and stood at the command post and refreshed maps and waited, because there was nothing else for them to do. Ground teams walked slow grid lines across terrain that fought them for every step. The helicopter crew scanned the deep shadowed bottoms of the drainages, the sheltered low spots where someone might try to get out of the wind.
2 people in 2 million acres with no confirmed route beyond the trailhead and no plan left behind. It's not really a search, it's a long shot, and to me, that's the cruelest part of this whole thing.
The last thing Rachel ever wrote, sent hours after all the others and never delivered either, was only a handful of words. Just that Cam felt cold, and that she only wanted to go home. That was all. It never even left the phone. They were found on the 4th day, the two of them lying not far apart, well below the lake and well off of any trail, tucked into a jumble of granite boulders where they had clearly tried to shelter themselves from the wind. Investigators recovered the phone from beneath those boulders, and even though its battery had been dead for days, forensic examiners were later able to pull the videos and the unsent messages off of it. They were together, right to the end. The Inyo County coroner would later rule that both had died of hypothermia, and investigators believed they had most likely died that first night, within hours of losing their way. The examination also documented injuries consistent with a hard fall on that ground in the pitch dark. There was no sign that anyone else had ever been near them. The man in the old truck at the trailhead, the creepy guy from Cameron's little throwaway joke, was tracked down and spoken to and cleared completely. Just another camper who had driven off that same afternoon and had never once seen them again. The villain that so much of the internet wanted him to be turned out to be nobody at all. There was never a villain in this story, only the cold.
When they were found, it was clear that they'd made a dozen small mistakes, and every one traces back to the same route. The thing I can't get past, that they were out there alone.
What came home, instead of Cameron and Rachel, was the account, still sitting right there, still bright and cheerful, full of the pre-dawn laughter and the drive up, and the promise that the shot of the year was coming, a shot no one would ever get to see. And underneath every bit of it, known only to one grieving family, sat a phone full of text that never sent, a quieter and truer record, a young woman asking her big sister to send help in the morning. 100 of their trips had ended the exact way that every trip is supposed to end, with everybody home safe and warm by the weekend, already planning the next one. This one did not, and not because of bad luck, but because of a small handful of ordinary choices, nearly all of them made before they had even left the car. Their families, in the time since, have tried to turn the single worst thing that ever happened to them into a warning that might just save somebody else's daughter. They talk over and over about the unglamorous parts that do not make for good videos, about telling one trusted person your exact route and turnaround time before you go, about carrying a paper map and a real way to signal for help that does not lean on a cell tower that is not there, something as simple as a whistle or a satellite messenger, about turning back for the car while there is still good light, and about never trusting one phone to be your camera and your map and your only lifeline at once. None of it will bring the two of them back, but it might on some other afternoon be the one thing that gets the next person back to the trailhead before dark.
None of this had to happen, and that's what absolutely hurts me inside. Two young women killed not by a monster or a cliff, but by a late start, a dead phone, and the naivety of going in alone.
The Appalachian Trail is one of the most beautiful places in the country, stretching more than 2,000 miles from Georgia to Maine. Most people who hike it make it home with little more than sore legs and good memories, but late October in the Great Smoky Mountains is a different story. Along the ridges, the weather can change in minutes, temperatures drop fast, and the trail doesn't care how prepared you are. It just keeps going, and you either have what you need or you don't. On the morning of Saturday, October 22nd, 2016, Andrew O'Neill and Courtney Sweeney signed the trail register at Newfound Gap at 9:14 in the morning and headed north on the Appalachian Trail toward Peck's Corner Shelter. They were planning one night out, about 10 miles to Peck's Corner Shelter, one night, and back out by Sunday afternoon. A straightforward trip, the kind people do all the time. Andrew O'Neill was 25 from Boone, North Carolina, where he grew up fishing with his uncle and hiking the surrounding mountains. By his mid-20s, he was living in Asheville, working at a bike shop, and always had another outdoor trip in the works. His mom said he called every Sunday without fail, and somehow always seemed to know when she'd had a hard week.
He seemed like a really easy person to care about, and Andrew had found someone who appreciated those parts of him just as much as everyone else did.
It was his girlfriend, Courtney Sweeney, 26 from Knoxville, Tennessee. She worked as a vet tech at a small animal clinic. The people who knew her best said she was quietly dependable, someone who never needed to be the loudest person in the room to make people feel taken care of. She'd done some hiking before, including a guided 2-day trip in Virginia, and while she wasn't as experienced or as obsessed with it as Andrew, she enjoyed being outdoors and was looking forward to spending the weekend with him.
They really balanced each other out in a way that just made sense.
This was actually their first real backcountry overnight together as a couple. Andrew had done shorter trips before, and Courtney had her guided section in Virginia, but this was the first time they were doing something like this on their own, just the two of them. That kind of trip means something different than a day hike. You're out there together, relying on each other. No easy way out if something goes sideways. For a lot of couples, it's a milestone. For Andrew and Courtney, it was supposed to be exactly that. The trip had been Andrew's idea, which surprised no one. He'd been talking about doing a serious stretch of the Smokies for over a year. Not just a day hike, but a real overnight with a backcountry permit and everything. Sometime in the late summer of 2016, the talking became specific enough that Courtney understood it was actually happening this time. He'd picked the route, gotten the permit, looked at the elevation profile, and decided it was completely manageable. He talked about it constantly in the weeks leading up to it. at the bike shop, on the phone with his mom, to anyone at work who would listen? Courtney said yes, for a few reasons. One thing I learned while putting this story together was that she was really looking forward to spending the weekend with Andrew. She'd enjoyed the guided hike she'd done in Virginia a couple of years earlier, and this overnight trip felt like a chance to get back out into the mountains together. And honestly, it sounds like exactly the kind of weekend most of us could use. Just a night in the mountains, away from everything, with the people we love. They weren't wildly underprepared or anything like that. Honestly, for the forecast they had that morning, their gear probably looked pretty reasonable to most people. Layers, rain jackets, broken-in boots, enough food for the trip, the kind of setup you'd see on probably half the people at that trailhead on any given weekend. What they didn't have were the kind of serious waterproof shells that only really matter when the weather stops being inconvenient and starts being dangerous. The difference between a rain jacket and a proper waterproof shell sounds like a minor thing until you're standing on an exposed ridgeline in freezing rain at 5,000 feet and your layers are soaked through in 10 minutes. And here's the thing that makes it genuinely frustrating. Most people could do that exact same trip with that exact same gear and never have a problem. The Smokies in late October can be cold and beautiful and completely fine. It just wasn't fine that day. They left Knoxville before 6 that morning while it was still dark and started the drive toward Newfound Gap. The permit was booked, the route was planned, and Andrew had been excited about this trip for over a year. So far, everything was going according to plan. They stopped for coffee at a gas station outside of Knoxville. Bad coffee in paper cups that somehow tastes exactly right at 5:30 in the morning when you're heading somewhere. If you're driving into the Smokies that early, you've probably got the route up on your GPS anyway, even if you already know where you're going. It gives you something to glance at besides the dark road ahead. The drive into the park is one of those things that's hard to describe to someone who hasn't done it. The road climbs steadily through Gatlinburg, and then the town just falls away behind you, and suddenly you're inside the park. The trees closing in on both sides, the road getting narrower and darker. By the time you reach Newfound Gap, the sky had gone from black to a flat gray. Overcast, still. The temperature sitting at 41 degrees. Cold, but manageable. The kind of cold that feels fine once you're moving. They pulled into the Newfound Gap parking area a little after 9 that morning. Packs came out of the car, boots hit the pavement, and before long, they were walking toward the trail register. Andrew had his pack on before Courtney had finished adjusting her straps. Those last few minutes before you start a hike always feel strangely ordinary. You're checking your gear one last time, tightening a few straps, maybe wondering if you packed too much or not enough. Then you shoulder your pack and start walking. There was a ranger at the trailhead that morning who'd worked that section of the park for years. And if you're wondering whether anyone warned them about the weather, the answer is yes. Before they headed out, they spent a few minutes talking with him about the forecast. A cold front was moving in from the northwest. Temperatures were expected to drop, and there was a real chance of freezing rain along the higher ridgelines. He looked over their gear and asked if they had serious waterproof shells. Andrew told him they had rain jackets. So there's that. Once you've told the ranger you've got rain gear, the conversation pretty much becomes, all right, just keep an eye on the weather and don't wait too long to turn around. And that's exactly what he told them. The front seemed to be moving in faster than expected, and if the weather came in early, he said not to hesitate to head back. Just keep an eye on the weather and don't wait too long to turn around. And that's exactly what he told them. The front seemed to be moving in faster than expected, and if the weather came in early, he said not to hesitate to head back. The ranger watched them sign the register at 9:14 and watched them head north along the trail. The man had done everything he could. There's something kind of heavy about that job, honestly. You see groups come through every single day. You give them the information. You look at their gear. You say what you can say, and then you watch them walk into the trees and hope for the best. That's pretty much where it ends for you. The first few miles of that section of trail are genuinely beautiful, and I say that as someone who has spent a fair amount of time in the Smokies. The forest is old-growth hardwood, oak and maple and yellow birch, and in late October the leaves still on the trees are deep red and orange, and the ones on the ground are thick and soft underfoot. The whole forest floor covered in this dense, wet carpet of color. The trail is well maintained through the lower sections, wide enough to walk comfortably, the grade gentle enough that you can move and talk at the same time without losing your breath.
It's easy to see why so many people fall in love with this trail. It feels like the kind of place you could spend all day without looking at your phone once.
When the thru hiker passed them at noon, he described Andrew slightly ahead, Courtney keeping pace, both of them seeming happy. 6 miles in and still moving well, still on track. Whatever the morning looked like for them out there, it sounds like it was exactly the kind of day they'd been looking forward to. From there, it's a steady climb north. The trail winds through dense spruce and fir forest, and before long, you're completely surrounded by trees. It's a beautiful stretch of trail, especially that time of year. The first few miles probably would have felt pretty uneventful. Cool, quiet, and exactly what you'd expect from a fall morning in the Smokies. But as the trail climbed higher, things started to change. The grade got steeper, the trees opened up, and the wind had fewer places to hide. Nothing that would have made you stop and think, we should turn around. Just little changes that are easy to brush off when you're focused on getting where you're going. Above 5,000 feet, the trail surface changes. The soft leaf cover of the lower sections gives way to exposed rock and root, and the wind that was barely noticeable an hour earlier starts finding the gaps in your layers. The temperature up there runs several degrees colder than the valley, and on an overcast October afternoon with a front moving in, that difference is not subtle. By this point, the details become a little harder to pin down. But after hours of hiking uphill with overnight packs, even slightly damp base layers could become dangerous once the temperature dropped and freezing rain moved in.
Under ordinary conditions, it wouldn't have mattered. It was what happened next that changed everything.
Around noon, about 6 miles north of Newfound Gap, they passed a southbound thru hiker who had started in Maine weeks earlier and was nearing the final stretch of his hike toward Georgia. He would later tell investigators he remembered seeing the couple that afternoon as they continued toward Peck's Corner shelter before the weather deteriorated. It would be the last confirmed sighting of Andrew and Courtney. He remembered Andrew and Courtney clearly afterward. Andrew was moving well, a little ahead of Courtney, setting a pace that was slightly ambitious for where they were in the day. Courtney was keeping up, but carrying that particular tiredness that settles in around mile 6 with a full overnight pack. They both seemed happy. Andrew said, "Hey." Courtney gave a small wave. They passed each other the way hikers pass each other on trail and kept moving in opposite directions. What he remembered most was the sky. He'd been watching it for the last hour from the ridgeline sections he'd come through, and what he saw to the northwest had been making him uneasy in the specific way that months of living outside teaches you. The color of the clouds, the way they were moving, the quality of the light underneath them. He'd seen that combination before, and he knew what it usually meant and how fast it could arrive.
That's one of those instincts that usually comes from seeing the same thing over and over again. People who've spent enough time outdoors tend to trust that feeling, even when they can't fully explain it.
They had no way of knowing what he'd seen in the sky behind them. He picked up his pace after that. He'd been watching that sky long enough to know he didn't want to be on the exposed sections when it finally came in. He made it to shelter before the worst of it hit. Andrew and Courtney were still heading north. The next 2 hours were quiet. The trail kept climbing and the sky stayed gray and flat, the kind of stretch where the miles start blending together. They continued north toward Peck's Corner shelter. Still making progress, just slower than they had been earlier that day. And look, at that point, they'd been out there for hours. Legs tired, packs heavy. The shelter was close enough that it was probably the only thing on either of their minds. Just get there. How far could 2 more miles really be, right? This all happened incredibly fast. Less than 2 hours earlier, they'd still been moving well, making progress on track. Now, the weather was changing by the minute, and before long, the wind chill would be down around 8 degrees. The sky had been changing for a while by then, though it was the kind of change that's easy to explain away. The clouds to the northwest had gone from gray to something darker and lower, and the wind that had been light all morning was starting to have an edge to it. The temperature had already dropped a few degrees from where it had been at noon. Nothing that would have stopped anyone. Just the kind of thing you notice and file away and keep walking through. By 2 in the afternoon, the temperature had dropped from 41 degrees to 28 degrees in under 90 minutes. And I want you to really sit with that for a second, because that is not a gradual chill. That is not the afternoon getting a little cooler the way afternoons do in October. That is the mountain deciding something, and deciding it fast. The wind showed up first. Along the exposed ridgeline, where there weren't many trees left to block it, it started building from a light breeze into something you could really feel. Gusts were pushing 30 to 35 miles an hour coming straight out of the northwest. Then the freezing rain moved in. Not a heavy downpour, just a cold, steady mist that seemed to stick to everything almost instantly. Jackets, gloves, backpacks, the rocks under their boots, even the exposed skin on their faces. It didn't take long before the trail started getting slick, especially across the exposed sections.
That's the thing about mountain weather. It doesn't always arrive all at once. Sometimes it just gets a little worse, then a little worse, until you suddenly realize you're in a situation that's become genuinely dangerous.
By the time the weather really started to move in, they were approaching one of the more exposed sections of the ridgeline, where the trees offered very little protection from the wind. Peck's Corner shelter was still only a couple of miles ahead. Going back meant retracing roughly 8 miles to Newfound Gap. On a normal day, another couple of miles wouldn't sound like much. In freezing rain, with the temperature still dropping, it suddenly feels a whole lot farther. And if you're standing out there trying to make that decision, with the weather getting worse by the minute, there probably isn't an obvious right answer. It didn't take long for their clothing to become soaked. At 28 degrees with winds around 35 miles an hour, the wind chill was down near 8 degrees Fahrenheit. And once you reach that point, your body starts losing heat faster than it can replace it. It doesn't matter how determined you are or how badly you want to keep going, biology eventually wins.
So now they're faced with a decision. What do you do? You're about 8 miles from Newfound Gap, with only a couple miles left to the shelter, soaked through, and the weather is getting worse by the minute.
Turning back means 8 miles in the dark and the cold, with no guarantee it gets better. Going forward means another couple of miles, but at least there's a shelter at the end of it. It's not a crazy decision. It's the kind of decision that makes complete sense until it doesn't. They continued north toward the shelter. The weather caught up to them quickly. The conditions that hit that ridgeline were not the kind you could simply hike through. Within a short distance of where the storm caught them, the trail had become something different entirely, and the people walking it had too. Hypothermia doesn't arrive all at once. It builds gradually, and that's part of what makes it so dangerous. It starts with shivering, which is the body's way of trying to generate heat and keep the core temperature up. The problem is that shivering burns a lot of energy, and after miles on the trail carrying full packs in worsening weather, there wasn't much left to burn. Eventually, though, the cold starts taking more than the body can give back. That's when coordination begins to slip. Not all at once, just in small ways that are easy to brush off. Your footing becomes a little less steady, and even simple things like stepping over rocks or navigating uneven ground start taking more effort than they should. You're still moving, so it's easy to tell yourself you're okay, but the body isn't working the way it was an hour earlier. And look, the section of trail Andrew and Courtney were on at that point wasn't doing them any favors. Exposed ridgeline, iced over rock, wind coming hard from the northwest with nothing to slow it down. The kind of terrain that's already demanding on a good day with dry gear and fresh legs. They had none of those things. Soaked through, energy running low, bodies working overtime just to stay warm every step on that trail would have been a genuine fight. And then comes the part that's especially dangerous. Judgment starts to go. In the mid to late stages of hypothermia, the mind loses its ability to accurately assess the situation it's in. People underestimate how serious things have become. They overestimate their ability to push through it. They make decisions that feel completely logical in the moment because the very part of the brain that would recognize something is wrong is no longer working the way it should.
It's one of the more quietly terrifying things the human body can do to itself. It's hard to think of anything more unfair than your own mind turning against you.
Andrew and Courtney had been in those conditions for well over an hour by the time the worst of it set in. And remember, they'd already been out there for hours. Just staying upright on that trail would have taken a lot more effort than it had earlier that afternoon. Wet through, cold to the core, still moving but moving differently than they had been at mile 2 or mile 4. The trail ahead of them was the same trail it had always been. The mountain had not changed. By then, prolonged exposure to freezing rain, strong wind, and falling temperatures would have placed anyone at significant risk of hypothermia. After the thru-hiker passed them, no one else is known to have seen Andrew and Courtney alive. From that point on, investigators had to reconstruct what happened from the evidence left behind. Based on where they were later found, they believe Andrew was ahead of Courtney when conditions deteriorated. At some point along an exposed stretch of ridgeline, he apparently left the trail and came to rest below it. Courtney was later found about 240 feet farther along the trail against the base of a large red oak just off the trail, its raised roots offering a small break from the direct force of the wind. The evidence suggests she continued a short distance after Andrew left the trail before stopping there. Whether she knew what had happened to him, we'll never know. By that stage, however, severe hypothermia can significantly impair judgment, coordination, and decision-making. The evidence at the scene reflected just how far hypothermia had progressed. When Courtney was found, her jacket was unzipped.
Courtney's unzipped jacket may seem confusing at first, but it's actually one of the most recognizable signs of severe hypothermia. In its later stages, something called paradoxical undressing can happen.
As the body's systems begin to fail, blood vessels near the skin suddenly dilate, creating an intense and completely convincing sensation of heat. The person genuinely feels like they're overheating, so they do the only thing that makes sense to them: they start taking layers off. They have no way of knowing that the feeling is completely backwards, that their core temperature is dangerously low, and that removing a jacket in 28-degree weather is doing exactly the opposite of what their body needs. No call was ever made from that ridgeline. There was no cell service on that section of trail, and by the time the weather had turned and the temperature had dropped, they were already too far in and too compromised for it to have mattered anyway. The storm moved through, and by Sunday morning, the trail was quiet again, the way remote places go quiet after weather passes, like nothing had happened there at all. When Andrew and Courtney didn't return to the trailhead by Sunday evening, the people who loved them started feeling that particular dread of calls that go straight to voicemail. And look, at first there was still room to tell yourself it was nothing. Cell service in the backcountry is unreliable, maybe they decided to stay an extra night, maybe the battery was dead. You find reasons to believe the thing you need to believe. But by Monday morning, the reasons were running out. Both families had been in contact with each other and with the Park Service, and a formal search was launched that afternoon. The Smokies, after a late October storm, are not easy terrain to move through quickly. Visibility in the backcountry was limited, the trail conditions were poor, and the search teams were working a remote section of trail with no roads in and no shortcuts out. They covered what they could each day and came back the next morning and covered more. Teams moved into the backcountry from Newfound Gap and worked south through the trail section systematically. The terrain slowed everything down. The Smokies don't make anything easy, and waiting on news from a search team in that kind of country is one of the harder things a family can be asked to do. It was a search team moving north from Newfound Gap on Tuesday morning that found them. Andrew was located first at the base of a short drop off the ridgeline, about 8 miles from the register. He was still in the spot where he'd come to rest after the fall. 240 feet further up the trail, they found Courtney, seated against the base of a large red oak, her back against the raised roots, her jacket open. The scene told most of the story on its own. 8 miles in, 2 miles short of the shelter, the storm had caught them right in the worst possible stretch of that trail, and they never made it out of it. Someone had to make those calls. To Andrew's mom in Boone, to Courtney's family in Knoxville. There is no good way to make a call like that, and there is no good way to receive one. And the people on both ends of those calls that Tuesday morning carried what happened on that ridgeline with them from that point forward. The thru hiker who had passed them at noon finished his hike a few weeks later and heard about what happened sometime after that. He said he'd thought about them when the storm hit that afternoon, felt the temperature drop on the trail, and wondered about the couple he'd passed heading the other way. Said he never really stopped thinking about whether saying something would have changed anything. There's probably no good answer to that, but it's the kind of thing that stays with you. Courtney's camera was recovered from the outer pocket of her pack. The last photo on it was timestamped 12:47 that afternoon. Andrew and Courtney are standing together at a small overlook where the trail briefly opens up to a view of the Tennessee Valley. They're both smiling. Looking at it now, it's hard to believe what was only a few hours away. The freezing rain started less than 90 minutes after that picture was taken. Andrew's mom Linda still calls his phone sometimes, not because she expects anything on the other end, just because she isn't ready to stop hearing his voice on the voicemail, and some distances don't close the way you need them to, and the mountains don't explain themselves to anyone.
There's something about stories like this that make you want to text the people you love when it's over. If someone's on your mind right now, they probably wouldn't mind hearing from you.